already on fire. That's not where this story begins, but it's where the Iranian war planners assumed it would end. The entire doctrine behind what was hidden inside a gorge in the southern Alborz Mountains, less than 40 kilometers northeast of Tehran, was built around a single premise: that the weapons concealed there would never need to be used, because the threat of their existence would be sufficient. And for that premise to hold, the weapons could never be found. They were found on a Wednesday. Not by a spy. Not by a defector. Not through a communications intercept or a bribed official or any of the traditional methods that had historically compromised Iranian military secrets. They were found by a geologist, a civilian contractor working at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, who was reviewing subsurface density measurements from a synthetic aperture radar platform that had been retasked over northern Iran during the early phase of Operation Epic Fury. She was not looking for a missile base. She was mapping fault lines, because one of the campaign's secondary objectives required updated seismic data for targeting calculations against facilities in the Tehran Basin. The Alborz Mountains presented a complex geological picture: Jurassic limestone over Paleozoic formations, dense Eocene volcanic tuffs in the south-central ridges, sedimentary layers folded and faulted by millions of years of tectonic compression between the Arabian and Eurasian plates. Understanding how blast energy would propagate through that geology required detailed mapping. The geologist was providing that mapping. What she noticed was not a tunnel. It was the absence of density where density should have existed. Along the southern slopes of the Alborz, northeast of Tehran, the terrain rises sharply from the urban sprawl into steep, narrow gorges cut by seasonal rivers that drain snowmelt from peaks exceeding 3,000 meters. These gorges are geological scars, places where water has spent millennia carving through limestone and shale, creating natural channels that are narrow at the bottom, steep-walled, and largely invisible from directly overhead unless a satellite's orbital geometry happens to catch them at the right angle. The Darabad Gorge was one such feature. It originated near the ridgeline above Tehran's northeastern suburbs and cut northward into increasingly remote terrain. Hikers used the lower portions. Mountain goats used the upper reaches. According to every survey, geological database, and overhead image collected over the previous 2 decades, nothing else used it at all. The synthetic aperture radar disagreed. At 3 points along the gorge's eastern wall, over a stretch of approximately 4 kilometers, the radar returned density readings that were inconsistent with the surrounding geology. The limestone in this section of the Alborz should have presented a relatively uniform density profile, roughly 2.5 to 2.7 grams per cubic centimeter, typical for the Jurassic carbonate formations that dominate the central range. Instead, the radar detected zones where the density dropped sharply, then recovered, then dropped again, in a pattern that did not match any natural geological feature.
Not a cave system.
Not a water table anomaly.
Not a fault zone.
The voids were too regular, too evenly spaced, and too deep to be anything produced by erosion or tectonics. The geologist flagged the anomalies and wrote a brief technical note suggesting they warranted further investigation. She classified it as a subsurface irregularity of unknown origin and moved on to the next section of her fault line survey. The note sat in a queue for 11 hours before an imagery analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency pulled it out and cross-referenced the coordinates with every existing intelligence database covering northern Iran. The coordinates matched nothing. No known military facility. No suspected facility. No historical reporting. No signals intelligence. No human intelligence. The location was, as far as the entire American intelligence apparatus was concerned, empty. That emptiness was the first indicator that it was not. Iran does not leave empty spaces unprotected. And when an imagery analyst began pulling archived satellite imagery of the Darabad Gorge at various resolutions across multiple years, the picture that emerged was one of extraordinarily disciplined concealment. Not the concealment of something hastily hidden, but the concealment of something that had never been intended to be visible at all. The first anomaly appeared in imagery from 2011. A discoloration on the eastern wall of the gorge, roughly 60 meters above the streambed, visible only in a narrow-band infrared capture taken during a winter overflight when snow cover on the surrounding terrain created a high-contrast background. The discoloration was consistent with freshly exposed rock, as if a small section of the cliff face had been recently altered. By the next available image, taken 4 months later, the discoloration was gone. The rock matched its surroundings perfectly. Someone had either applied a surface treatment or allowed enough weathering to occur that the disturbance became invisible. A second anomaly appeared in 2014.
Not visual. Thermal.
A brief, faint heat signature emanating from the gorge wall during a pre-dawn pass, when ambient temperatures had dropped to near freezing and any artificial heat source would stand out against the cold limestone. The signature lasted for one satellite pass and was not detected again for 8 months, when it reappeared in almost exactly the same location during another cold weather window. The intermittency suggested a ventilation system operating on a controlled schedule, venting heat only during periods when atmospheric conditions would dissipate the thermal plume before the next overhead collection opportunity. Someone had studied the satellite schedules. Someone had calculated the thermal dissipation rates. Someone had designed a ventilation protocol specifically to avoid detection by orbital infrared sensors. That level of sophistication did not come from a local garrison or a provincial militia. It came from an organization that understood exactly how the United States collected intelligence from space and had engineered countermeasures against each collection method: the IRGC Aerospace Force. Within 48 hours of the geologist's initial flag, the Darabad Gorge had been assigned its own intelligence collection cell. Satellites were retasked, orbital parameters adjusted, signals intelligence platforms redirected to listen for any electromagnetic emissions from the area, and a request was sent to the National Security Agency for a retroactive analysis of all communications metadata associated with cellular and radio traffic within a 20-kilometer radius of the gorge over the preceding 5 years. The NSA's analysis returned results that transformed the investigation from a geological curiosity into an operational crisis. Over the preceding 5 years, a pattern of cellular activity had occurred within the gorge that was invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. Individual phones, each used for no more than 72 hours before being discarded, had connected to a cellular tower serving the area at intervals that correlated with known IRGC logistics schedules. The phones never made calls. They sent brief encrypted data packets to a server that was traced, through a chain of digital cutouts, to an IP address associated with the IRGC Aerospace Force's internal communications network. The content of the packets was unrecoverable, but their timing, their destination, and the pattern of their transmission told a story. Personnel were moving into and out of the gorge on a schedule. Equipment was being delivered. Reports were being sent. And it had been happening for years. The next piece came from the geological analysis itself. The subsurface voids that the synthetic aperture radar had detected were not random cavities. When the geologist refined her density models and applied three-dimensional reconstruction algorithms, the voids resolved into a coherent structure. A main bore, roughly 8 meters in diameter, running parallel to the gorge wall at a depth of approximately 120 meters below the surface. Branching off this main bore at irregular intervals were smaller passages, 4 to 5 meters in diameter, extending both deeper into the mountain and toward the gorge wall itself. At 3 locations along the main bore, the void expanded dramatically into chambers approximately 40 meters wide and 20 meters tall, large enough to house heavy vehicles, industrial equipment, or weapons systems of considerable size. The facility was not a simple storage cache. The dimensions suggested something far more significant. The main bore's 8-meter diameter was precisely the dimension required to accommodate the largest transporter erector launcher vehicles in Iran's inventory, the TEL systems designed to carry the Sejal solid-fuel medium-range ballistic missile. The Sejal, with a range exceeding 2,000 kilometers, was the crown jewel of Iran's indigenous missile program, a 2-stage solid-fuel weapon that could reach any point in the Middle East and much of southeastern Europe. It was faster to launch than liquid-fueled alternatives, harder to intercept due to its depressed trajectory capability, and far more survivable because it did not require the lengthy fueling process that made liquid-fuel missiles vulnerable during preparation. The chambers matched the footprint of missile preparation bays observed at known IRGC facilities. The branching passages aligned with the configuration of TEL staging areas, where launcher vehicles could be loaded, armed, and positioned for rapid deployment. And the main bore's trajectory, running parallel to the gorge before curving toward the northern face of the ridge, suggested concealed exits on the mountain's far side, exits that would allow TEL vehicles to emerge onto pre-surveyed firing positions with direct line of sight to the sky and retreat back underground before counterfire could be directed against them. Iran had built a launch-ready missile base less than 40 kilometers from central Tehran, inside a gorge that hikers walked through on weekends, and no one had known. The proximity to Tehran was itself revealing. Iran's known missile bases were dispersed across the country's provinces, positioned to provide geographic redundancy and complicate targeting. But a facility this close to the capital served a different strategic purpose. It was a weapon of last resort. A retaliatory capability positioned so close to the political center of gravity that any attacker would face an impossible calculation: strike Tehran, and the missiles emerge from the mountains above it within minutes. The facility's purpose was not first strike capability. It was guaranteed second strike capability, the ability to retaliate even after the country's dispersed military infrastructure had been degraded. This changed the operational calculus fundamentally. The known missile bases in Kermanshah, Hormuzgan, Lorstan, and across the Zagros range were important military targets. But a hidden base near Tehran, equipped with Sejal missiles capable of reaching American bases across the region, Gulf state capitals, and Allied territories, was a strategic threat of an entirely different magnitude. If the facility survived Operation Epic Fury, it could serve as the launch point for a retaliatory strike that would dwarf anything Iran had yet demonstrated. The intelligence assessment landed on the desk of the CENTCOM commander within 72 hours of initial detection. The recommendation was immediate. The facility had to be characterized fully and struck before the ceasefire negotiations, which were already underway, could freeze the operational picture. But characterizing a facility buried 120 meters deep in Alborz limestone, accessible only through a narrow mountain gorge, with concealment protocols specifically designed to defeat American intelligence collection, was not a problem that could be solved by simply looking harder. The geology team at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency went to work. The Alborz range in this section was composed primarily of Jurassic limestone, the Lar Formation carbonates that dominated the central range, overlying older shale and sandstone from the Shemshak Formation. The limestone was competent rock, dense and relatively uniform, which explained why the tunnels had been carved there. Limestone is easier to excavate than granite, but strong enough to support large underground chambers without extensive reinforcement. It was the same logic that had guided the construction of the ancient Qanat water systems that ran beneath Iranian cities for millennia, and the same logic that made limestone the preferred medium for military tunnel construction worldwide. But limestone has a property that the IRGC's engineers had either underestimated or accepted as an unavoidable risk.
It is soluble.
Over geological time, water percolating through limestone dissolves calcium carbonate along fracture planes, creating networks of microfissures and enlarged joints that weaken the rock's structural integrity in ways that are invisible to the naked eye but detectable by high-resolution density mapping. These dissolution features act as pre-existing stress concentrators. Apply sufficient force to the rock, a blast wave from a detonation at depth for instance, and the energy propagates preferentially along these weakened planes, creating fractures that extend far beyond what the same blast would produce in homogeneous rock. The geologists identified 3 such dissolution zones along the length of the Darabad facility. Each corresponded to an area where seasonal water infiltration from the gorge above had spent centuries weakening the limestone along natural fracture sets. And each dissolution zone happened to intersect with or lie adjacent to one of the facility's enlarged chambers. The mountain's own hydrology had created structural weak points at the worst possible locations from the facility's perspective and the best possible locations from a targeting perspective. The strike plan that emerged from this analysis was built on a principle that had been validated spectacularly at the Hormuzgan tunnel complex weeks earlier: engineered geological collapse. Rather than attempting to penetrate the full 120 meters of overburden to reach the main tunnel bore, the plan targeted the dissolution zones. Each zone represented a natural stress concentrator that, if subjected to sufficient blast pressure, would initiate fracturing along pre-existing weakness planes. The fracturing would propagate downward through the rock column, intersecting with the tunnel chambers below and compromising their structural integrity. The mountain would do the work that the weapon alone could not. 3 GBU, 57 massive ordnance penetrators were allocated to the Darabad target. Each weapon weighed approximately 30,000 pounds and carried over 5,300 pounds of explosive. Its casing, forged from high-density Eglin steel, was designed to survive the extreme stresses of penetrating through dozens of meters of earth and rock before detonation. The weapon's GPS and inertial guidance system would bring it to within meters of the programmed impact point. The large penetrator smart fuse would determine detonation timing based on penetration depth and the characteristics of the material the bomb was passing through. But the Darabad target presented a complication that Hormuzgan had not.
The gorge.
The narrow, steep-walled canyon running along the facility's western face created a complex aerodynamic environment for a weapon descending from high altitude. Winds channeling through the gorge, thermal updrafts from the sun-warmed rock walls, turbulence generated by the terrain's irregular geometry, all of these factors introduced potential guidance errors that could place a weapon meters from its intended aim point. And at this target, meters mattered. The dissolution zones were not broad areas. They were specific geological features, some less than 15 meters across, where the maximum structural vulnerability was concentrated. A weapon that missed a dissolution zone by 20 meters would detonate incompetent limestone, producing localized damage but failing to initiate the cascading fracture that the entire strike plan depended on. The targeting team compensated with a technique that had not been employed with GBU-57s before. Each weapon's guidance solution was calculated not from a standard atmospheric model, but from a terrain-specific aerodynamic profile that incorporated the gorge's geometry, predicted wind patterns based on meteorological data from the preceding 48 hours, and thermal modeling of the rock face's radiative effects on near-surface air currents. The approach was computationally intensive and required weather data that was fresh within hours of the planned strike time. A meteorological reconnaissance drone, too small and slow to attract attention, loitered at altitude over the Darabad area for 6 hours prior to the strike window, feeding real-time atmospheric data to the targeting cell. The B-2 Spirit assigned to the Darabad mission launched from Diego Garcia, where the bombers had been forward deployed since the opening days of the campaign. It carried 2 GBU-57s. A second B-2 carried the third weapon. The mission profile called for a southwesterly approach, crossing into Iranian airspace over the western portion of the country where air defense coverage had been most thoroughly suppressed during the campaign's first weeks. Iran's S-300 batteries and indigenous Bavar 373 systems in the northern sector had been targeted early and repeatedly. Assessment data indicated that effective air defense coverage in the Tehran corridor had been degraded by roughly 70%, though the possibility of surviving mobile systems could not be entirely discounted. The bombers flew at altitudes exceeding 50,000 feet, well above the engagement envelope of any remaining short-range systems and at the outer edge of what the degraded long-range systems could plausibly track. The B-2's radar cross-section, measured in fractions of a square meter, made detection at that altitude functionally impossible for anything short of a fully operational, cued early warning system. Iran no longer possessed such a system. At 0247 local time on a night in mid-April, the first B-2's weapons bay doors opened above the southern Alborz. The aircraft was positioned approximately 31 kilometers south-southwest of the Darabad Gorge, offset from the target to account for the weapon's ballistic trajectory and the guidance corrections that would be applied during descent. The first GBU-57 separated cleanly and began falling. For the next 93 seconds, 30,000 pounds of steel and explosive dropped through the atmosphere at accelerating velocity. The weapon's grid fins adjusted continuously, making corrections measured in hundredths of a degree as it descended through the turbulent layer above the mountain terrain. The real-time meteorological data proved critical. At approximately 15,000 feet above ground level, a crosswind shear that the standard atmospheric model would not have predicted pushed the weapon 2.7 meters off its programmed trajectory. The guidance system corrected within 4 seconds, bringing the weapon back onto a flight path that would place it within 3 meters of the first dissolution zone. The GBU-57 struck the limestone ridge at a velocity exceeding 1,000 feet per second. It entered the rock like a nail driven by a hydraulic press. The Eglin steel casing fractured through the upper weathered zone, punched through competent Lar formation limestone, and continued downward. The large penetrator smart fuse registered the changing density of the material and calculated detonation timing. At a depth of approximately 55 meters, the bomb detonated. The blast did not need to reach the tunnel. The geology reached it instead. Over 5,000 pounds of explosive produced a pressure wave that radiated outward from the detonation point in every direction. In competent rock, this wave would have dissipated within a radius of perhaps 50 meters, creating a cavern of shattered limestone but leaving the tunnel chambers at 120 meters depth largely undisturbed. But the dissolution zone changed the equation entirely. The pre-existing network of water-enlarged fractures and weakened joint planes acted as conduits for the blast energy, channeling it downward along paths of least resistance. The pressure wave propagated through the dissolution zone at velocities and pressures far exceeding what the surrounding competent rock experienced. When it reached the boundary of the first enlarged chamber, it encountered the void space that the tunnel's excavation had created. The chamber's ceiling, 120 meters of limestone that had supported itself for geological ages, was now subjected to a dynamic stress load that arrived not uniformly from above, but preferentially along the very fracture planes that were already the weakest elements of the rock mass. The ceiling did not collapse all at once. It failed progressively, as individual fracture planes opened under the stress, connected with adjacent fractures, and created slabs of rock that detached from the ceiling and fell into the chamber below. Each slab that fell removed load-bearing material that had been supporting the slabs above it, creating a cascading failure that propagated upward through the rock column even as the blast energy continued to radiate outward. Within the chamber itself, the pressure wave that entered through the fracture network created overpressure sufficient to destroy anything that was not hardened to military blast resistance specifications. And transporter erector launchers, while robust vehicles, are not blast-hardened structures. They are designed to survive rough terrain, not underground detonations. Any missile system staged in the first chamber would have experienced blast overpressure, fragmentation from the collapsing ceiling, and the secondary effects of their own propellant and warhead materials responding to the thermal and kinetic energy of the event. 40 seconds later, the second weapon struck. The aim point was the second dissolution zone, approximately 1.4 kilometers north along the gorge from the first impact. The timing was not arbitrary. Seismic modeling predicted that at 40 seconds post-detonation, the stress waves from the first strike would have propagated through the rock mass and would be arriving at the second dissolution zone in a compressive phase. The rock was already stressed when the second weapon arrived, already weakened by the passage of energy through its fracture networks. The second detonation exploited this pre-existing stress, compounding it to a degree that exceeded what either weapon could have achieved independently. The second chamber collapse was more violent than the first. The geologists' models had predicted this, because the second dissolution zone was broader and more developed than the first, with fracture apertures that were wider and more interconnected. The blast energy found more pathways, propagated further and produced structural failure across a larger volume of rock. Satellite-mounted seismometers registered the event as two distinct pulses, the weapon's detonation and the subsequent rock mass failure, separated by approximately 1.3 seconds. The third weapon struck 11 minutes later, after the second B-2 had maneuvered into its release position. This weapon targeted the northernmost dissolution zone, the point where the main tunnel bore curved away from the gorge toward the concealed exits on the mountain's northern face. This was operationally the most critical aim point, because even if the southern chamber survived, the northern exits were where the TEL vehicles would need to emerge to launch. Sealing these exits would trap the surviving weapons inside the mountain as effectively as destroying them. The third GBU-57 detonated at a depth of 48 meters, slightly shallower than the first two because the dissolution zone at this location extended closer to the surface. The resulting collapse was different in character from the first two. Rather than a progressive sealing failure that propagated downward into a chamber, the third strike triggered a lateral collapse along the tunnel bore itself. The fracture network at this location ran roughly parallel to the tunnel's axis, and the blast energy propagating along these fractures produced a shearing failure that displaced an entire section of the tunnel wall inward, filling the bore with thousands of tons of fractured rock across a distance of approximately 300 meters. The concealed exits were not merely blocked. The rock that had contained them was no longer structurally coherent. Reopening them would require not clearing debris from an intact tunnel, but re-excavating through a rock mass that had been converted from stratified limestone into a jumbled aggregate of displaced blocks, some the size of automobiles, compressed together under the weight of the overburden above. Years of work, boring machines, and the certainty that every satellite in orbit would be watching. Post-strike imagery arrived in stages. The first indicator came from seismic monitoring stations across the region, which recorded 3 distinct events at the correct times, locations and magnitudes to confirm successful detonations. The second came from optical satellites passing over the area within hours. The gorge itself showed no dramatic surface changes visible to the casual observer.
No Hollywood crater.
No mushroom cloud frozen in aftermath. The strikes had occurred deep enough that the surface effects were subtle, but they were measurable. Interferometric synthetic aperture radar, which detects surface displacement measured in millimeters, showed that the ridgeline above the tunnel complex had subsided by approximately 11 centimeters along a 4-kilometer stretch. 11 centimeters does not sound like much until you understand what it represents. The mountain had settled into its own hollowed interior. Chambers that had been open were now closed. Tunnels that had been passable were now rubble-filled voids. Thermal imagery confirmed the assessment from a different angle. In the days before the strike, the faint thermal signatures that had originally betrayed the facility's existence had been detected at low levels, consistent with a facility operating at reduced capacity during wartime conditions. After the strike, the thermal signatures did not diminish. They vanished. The mathematical precision of the disappearance was itself telling. A facility that had been damaged but not destroyed would show residual heat from fires, from trapped machinery still operating, from the slow thermal decay of heated rock. A facility that showed zero residual thermal signature was a facility where the heat-generating equipment had either been destroyed or buried under enough rock that the thermal energy could no longer reach the surface through any pathway. But the most revealing intelligence came from the signals domain, and it arrived not as a dramatic intercept but as an absence. Before the strike, the NSA's retroactive analysis had identified the pattern of encrypted data transmissions from the Darabad area. These transmissions, sent from disposable phones at irregular but predictable intervals, had been the digital heartbeat of the facility, proof that personnel were present, that operations were continuing, that the base was alive. After the strike, the transmissions stopped. Not immediately, which would have suggested a communications blackout or a deliberate shutdown. They stopped over a period of approximately 72 hours, a pattern consistent with personnel at the periphery of the facility gradually realizing that the facility no longer existed as a functional entity and ceasing to report to a command structure that could no longer receive their reports. One final transmission was detected 41 hours after the strike, originating from a location approximately 3 kilometers north of the gorge. It was sent to the same IRGC Aerospace Force server that had received all previous transmissions from the site. The content, again, was encrypted and unrecoverable, but its metadata was informative. The transmission lasted 14 seconds and was sent from a phone that had never been used before and was never used again. It was, in all probability, a damage report. The last communication from a facility that had operated in complete secrecy for more than a decade and was now nothing more than rubble and silence. In the days that followed, American surveillance assets tracked the IRGC's response. Engineering assessment teams were dispatched from Tehran, traveling northeast on roads that were openly monitored by drones loitering at altitudes where they were invisible to the naked eye. The teams reached the gorge area, conducted surveys that lasted approximately 8 hours and departed. Their movements were methodical and unhurried, which itself communicated something. Teams assessing recoverable damage move with urgency. Teams documenting total loss move with the deliberate pace of professionals completing paperwork. No reconstruction equipment followed them. No boring machines. No concrete trucks. No earth movers. In the weeks after the Hormuzgan strikes, a similar absence of follow-on activity had been observed, and the interpretation had been the same. The assessment teams had looked, measured, photographed, and concluded that what they found was beyond repair within any time frame that mattered. The IRGC attempted one response that revealed the depth of the strategic loss. Within a week of the Darabad strike, signals intelligence detected a dramatic increase in encrypted communications traffic between IRGC Aerospace Force headquarters and the known missile base at Karamabad in Lorestan province, the facility that housed the largest number of missile silos in the country. The traffic pattern was consistent with an attempt to redistribute strategic assets, to compensate for the loss of the Darabad facility by dispersing its assigned mission to surviving sites. But the surviving sites were themselves under pressure. Karamabad had been struck 3 times during Operation Epic Fury. Its tunnel entrances had been collapsed and partially cleared, collapsed again and cleared again, in the grim cycle that had defined the entire campaign's approach to underground infrastructure. The facility was functional but degraded, and adding the Darabad mission to its burden meant stretching already damaged infrastructure to cover a gap that had never been planned for. Because the Darabad base had never been planned for in anyone's calculations except the IRGC's. Its existence had been unknown to every intelligence service outside Iran. Its destruction was therefore not merely the loss of a military asset but the loss of a strategic assumption. The IRGC had built its retaliatory doctrine on the certainty that the Darabad facility would survive any first strike because it could not be targeted if it could not be found. The discovery and destruction of the facility in a single operational sequence, from the geologist's initial flag to the last bomb's detonation in less than 3 weeks, invalidated a premise that had shaped Iranian strategic thinking for more than a decade. The deeper tunnels, the ones that extended below the main bore into what the density mapping suggested were secondary chambers or deep storage vaults at depths exceeding 180 meters, were beyond the direct reach of the GBU-57 even through the dissolution zones. But they were not beyond the reach of physics. The cascading collapse that the 3 strikes initiated propagated not just laterally along the tunnel system, but vertically through the rock column. The secondary chambers, if they existed, were now sealed beneath hundreds of meters of fractured, displaced rock. Whatever was stored at those depths, if anything was stored there, was entombed in a manner that made recovery a theoretical exercise rather than a practical one. You would need to bore a new shaft through the debris field, through rock that no longer possessed any structural predictability because its internal fracture patterns had been randomized by the blast events. Boring machines operate on the assumption that rock behaves in geologically predictable ways.
Post-strike rock does not.
The financial dimension of the loss was considerable, but secondary to the strategic one. Iran had invested an estimated amount in the range of hundreds of millions of dollars over more than a decade to excavate, equip, and conceal the Darabad facility. The missiles stored inside, Sejal medium-range ballistic missiles with a unit cost that reflected their status as the most advanced weapons in Iran's indigenous arsenal, represented an additional investment that could not be quickly replaced, particularly given that the production facilities that manufactured Sejal components had themselves been targeted during the campaign. The factory at Isfahan, the engine test facilities, the solid fuel propellant plants, all had been struck repeatedly. The supply chain that would produce replacement missiles was as damaged as the facility that had stored them. But the strategic loss transcended money and material. The Darabad base represented something that cannot be purchased or manufactured: strategic surprise. The IRGC had possessed a hidden retaliatory capability that no adversary knew about. That knowledge gap was, in itself, a weapon. An attacker planning a first strike against Iran would have calculated the number of known missile sites, estimated the number of missiles each could launch, and designed their attack to suppress that known capability. The hidden capability at Darabad existed outside those calculations entirely. It was the punch that the attacker could not plan for because they did not know it existed.
Now it was gone.
And its loss was not something that could be rebuilt by carving a new tunnel. The next hidden facility, if Iran attempted to build one, would face a surveillance environment that had fundamentally changed. The thermal detection method that had first betrayed Darabad was not a one-time technical achievement. It was a capability that would only improve with time, as sensor resolution increased and as the analytical methods for identifying subsurface thermal anomalies were refined by the very data that Darabad had provided. The geologist who had flagged the density anomaly had developed her techniques as part of a broader analytical framework that was now being applied retroactively to every stretch of Iranian mountain terrain that had not yet been examined. If there were other hidden facilities, they were now being searched for with instruments and methods that had been validated by success. For the defense establishments of nations that maintained their own underground military infrastructure, the Darabad strike added a specific lesson to the broader one that Hormuzgan had established weeks earlier. At Hormuzgan, the lesson was that sequenced detonations could exploit geological stress points to collapse entire tunnel networks. At Darabad, The lesson was different and in some ways more unsettling. You did not need to collapse the entire mountain. You did not need to penetrate to the target's depth. You needed to understand the geology well enough to identify where nature had already done most of the work, where water had spent centuries weakening the rock along fracture planes that extended from the surface to the target depth. Find those planes, strike them with sufficient force, and the geology does the rest. North Korea's tunnel complexes beneath the Korean peninsula are carved into granite, which is harder than limestone but not immune to fracture propagation along joint sets and foliation planes. China's underground submarine base at Yulin on Hainan Island is excavated into coastal rock formations that include both limestone and metamorphic units with known fault structures. Russia's strategic command facilities beneath Mount Yamantau sit in Ural granite that, while extraordinarily hard, contains the same types of natural fracture networks that exist in all crystalline rock masses. Every one of these facilities has its own version of the dissolution zones that doomed Darabad. The question is whether the geological surveys exist to find them. After Darabad, the answer is that they will be looked for. The gorge itself remains. The seasonal river still runs through it in spring. The limestone walls still rise on either side, indifferent to what was built inside them and indifferent to what destroyed it. If you hiked through the lower reaches today, you would see nothing that announced what had happened.
No crater. No scorched earth.
No monument to the facility that operated in secrecy for over a decade and ceased to exist in 11 minutes. The mountain absorbed the evidence the same way it had absorbed the weapons.
Quietly. Completely.
Leaving only the silence that follows when something that was hidden is found, and something that was built is unbuilt, and the calculation that it all rested on, that depth and darkness and patience were sufficient protection against an adversary with the right instruments, proves to have been not wrong in principle but fatally incomplete in practice. The Sejal missiles are still in there. Somewhere beneath the rubble, beneath the collapsed chambers and the fractured rock and the sealed passages, the weapons that were meant to guarantee Iran's retaliatory capability rest in darkness.
They will not launch.
They will not be recovered. They will corrode slowly over decades as groundwater, now flowing freely through the fracture networks that the strikes widened, reaches the steel casings and the solid fuel propellant and the guidance electronics and reduces them to components that will never again be assembled into a threat.
The mountain keeps them now.
Not as a guardian.
As a grave.
This is a speculative scenario. Real weapon systems, platforms, geological formations, and strategic doctrines are referenced, but the events depicted are entirely fictional. The radar operator on the T-0509 highway outside Mariupol barely had time to register the incoming object. 3 seconds of thermal signature on the screen. A flicker. Then the truck carrying fuel to the Donetsk front detonated in a column of orange and black, 95 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian position. The drone that killed it had been in the air for over 40 minutes, threading through gaps in Russian air defense coverage that no longer existed. This is how wars pivot. Not with a single decisive battle, but with the systematic dismantling of everything that feeds one. The liberation of the Donbass didn't begin with a grand charge across open ground. It began with a truck on fire on a highway that Russia thought was safe. Let's rewind to the math, because the math is where Russia's spring-summer 2026 campaign started dying before it ever had a chance to live. In April 2026, the Institute for the Study of War recorded something that hadn't happened since Ukraine's Kursk incursion in August 2024. Russia suffered a net loss of territory.
Not a slowdown. Not stagnation.
An actual retreat of the map. 116 square kilometers gone, swallowed back into Ukrainian control, as if the months of grinding Russian assaults had amounted to nothing more than a temporary stain. To understand how catastrophic that number is, you need the context around it. January 2026 saw Russia gaining 318 square kilometers. February dropped to 122. March collapsed to just 23, which is less than a square kilometer per day across the entire theater. And then April arrived, and the number went negative. The trend line doesn't just suggest that Russia's offensive is faltering. It proves it. The Kremlin poured more soldiers, more drones, more glide bombs into the Donbass than at any point since the full-scale invasion began, and the battlefield responded by handing them less than nothing. But this isn't a story about numbers on a chart. This is a story about a system that is breaking apart at every seam, from the frontline assault teams dying in waves against Ukrainian kill zones to the supply trucks being picked off by drones nearly 100 kilometers behind what Russia assumed was a secure rear area. And the breakage is accelerating. Start in the north, at Sloviansk. This city, along with its twin Kramatorsk, represents the beating heart of the fortress belt, the chain of fortified urban centers that Ukraine has spent 12 years turning into a defensive nightmare. Every road into Sloviansk passes through terrain that is mined, surveilled, and covered by overlapping fields of drone fire. Russia has been probing this area for months, and the results are exactly what you would expect when a force attempts to breach prepared defenses without the element of surprise. The chief of staff of a Ukrainian air defense battalion operating in the Sloviansk and Kramatorsk directions reported in early May that Russian assaults had actually decreased in the area. That might sound like good news for Russia, like a tactical pause to regroup.
It isn't.
Russian aerial reconnaissance and glide bomb strikes indicate that Russia is preparing for larger mechanized assaults as warmer weather dries out the mud and hardens the ground. They tried this before. In March, Russia launched a reinforced company-sized assault near Shandryholov, northwest of Lyman. It was an attempt to probe Ukrainian defenses, to find the weak points before the big push.
The assault failed.
The probing found nothing but drones and death. Now the spring is here, the ground is dry, and Russia is gearing up to try again. But the conditions that destroyed their March probe haven't changed. What has changed is that Ukraine now deploys 30% more strike drones than Russia across multiple sectors of the front, a reversal that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Slide south to Chasiv Yar, where the story of Russia's Donbass failure takes on an almost tragic repetition. For over 2 years, Russian forces have been trying to punch through this battered town to reach Kostiantynivka, 7 kilometers to the west.
Kostiantynivka leads to Kramatorsk.
Kramatorsk leads to Sloviansk.
That's the sequence. That's the plan.
And it has been stuck on step 1 for 26 months. In late April, the Russian 70th Motor Rifle Division threw an assault group at Ukrainian positions in western Chasiv Yar.
1 tank,
5 infantry fighting vehicles,
10 motorcycles,
assorted all-terrain vehicles. Ukraine's 24th Mechanized Brigade met them with drones, artillery, and entrenched infantry. The result was predictable. The attack was repelled. Enemy armored vehicles, transport, and assault troops were destroyed. The brigade's after-action summary read like a receipt for the obliteration of an entire combined arms element. The next day, Russia tried the same thing. Same composition,
same sector, same result.
2 days of mechanized assault, 2 days of total failure. And the 24th Mechanized Brigade went back to doing exactly what it had been doing before, holding. Russia's problem at Chasiv Yar is structural. Their mechanized columns are too noisy, too visible, and too slow against a defense optimized for exactly this kind of attack. Ukrainian drones detect the formations before they reach the line of contact, and then the kill chain activates. Artillery, first-person view kamikaze drones. Overhead surveillance drones directing adjustments in real time. By the time the Russian vehicles reach the Ukrainian positions, assuming they reach them at all, the assault teams have already been shredded. So Russia is pivoting. The same infiltration tactics that eventually cracked Pokrovsk are now being attempted at Chasiv Yar. Small groups of infantry, sometimes just 3 or 4 soldiers, moving on foot or on motorcycles through the gaps between Ukrainian surveillance zones. The goal is to slip past the Chasiv Yar defenders and entrench in Novodmitrivka, a village just east of Kostiantynivka. If enough Russian troops can dig in there, they cut the resupply route to Chasiv Yar and gain access to the H-20 road running north to Kramatorsk. But enough Russian troops is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. The infiltration has started. Ukrainian military analyst Konstantin Mashevets has confirmed ongoing Russian attempts to seize Novodmitrivka. So far, those attempts are being met by the same drone-saturated defense that stopped the mechanized assaults. Geolocated footage from early May shows Ukrainian forces striking Russian positions in northeastern and southern Kostiantynivka after what analysts assess were failed infiltration missions. The SW reported on May 8 that footage showed Ukrainian forces hitting Russian service members along the T-0504 Pokrovsk-Kostiantynivka highway in southern Kostiantynivka, again after an infiltration attempt. The pattern is consistent. Russia sends small groups. Ukraine finds them. The drones do the rest. Here is where the geometry of the Donbass becomes a trap for Russia rather than a corridor to victory. Russia is trying to advance on Kramatorsk and Sloviansk from multiple directions simultaneously. From the east through Chasiv Yar, from the south through the Pokrovsk axis, from the southeast through Kostiantynivka. Each of these axes demands a massive commitment of troops, drones, artillery, and logistics. And Russia simply does not have enough of any of these things to sustain simultaneous pressure across all of them. The consequences of that overextension are playing out in real time. Ukraine's commander-in-chief, General Oleksandr Syrsky, reported on May 2 that Russian forces intensified activity in the Kostiantynivka-Drushkivka tactical area in April, attacking 83 times in the Kostiantynivka direction in the final week of the month alone. That is an enormous number of assaults for a single sector. And yet, Ukrainian forces recently advanced in southern Dovabaka, southwest of Kostiantynivka, according to geolocated footage. Russia is pouring in attacks, and Ukraine is gaining ground. That is not how a successful offensive works. The reason why becomes clearer when you look at what is happening behind Russia's lines. And this brings us back to that burning truck on the T-0509 highway. Ukraine's mid-range drone campaign is the development that Russia did not see coming and still has no answer for. On May 8, the Ukrainian 1st Azov National Guard Corps reported that it struck Russian military targets near occupied Mariupol and is interdicting Russian logistics at depths of up to 160 kilometers from drone operator positions. Let that number sink in. 160 kilometers. That means Ukrainian drones are reaching into areas that Russia has been using as logistical staging grounds for the entire Donetsk offensive. The T-0509 highway, which runs from Mariupol to Donetsk city, is the primary supply artery feeding Russian forces operating along the northern front line and further northeast against the fortress belt. And now it is under active attack. Geolocated footage from May 6 and 8 confirms Ukrainian drone strikes on vehicles along this highway at points approximately 95 kilometers from the front line. Additional footage shows Ukrainian drones operating at points along the T-0509 between 95 and 104 kilometers from the front line and within Mariupol itself along the M14 highway that extends west into occupied Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts. This isn't harassment. This is the beginning of battlefield air interdiction by unmanned systems, a concept that military theorists have discussed for decades and that Ukraine is now executing with devastating practical effect. The ISW's assessment is direct. Ukraine's ability to conduct drone strikes against moving targets over 100 kilometers from the front line, in areas where Russian forces previously conducted logistics relatively risk-free, will likely achieve partial effects of battlefield air interdiction that degrade Russia's ability to conduct future offensive operations or defend against Ukrainian counterattacks. This isn't speculation. It is already happening. Ukraine has been intensifying its mid-range strike campaign since late December 2025 and has markedly increased the intensity and frequency of strikes since March 2026. In April alone, the Ukrainian Unmanned Systems Forces struck more than 65 logistics and ammunition depots, 33 drone control centers and workshops, and 17 troop command posts across occupied territory. The scope of this campaign is staggering. It is attacking every layer of the Russian war machine behind the front.
Fuel depots, ammunition storage, communication towers, Buk M3 air defense systems, Tor M2 systems, Strela 10 systems. Every time Ukraine destroys a Russian air defense asset, it opens a wider corridor for the next wave of drones to fly through. The Russians are caught in a loop they cannot break. And here is the part that turns Russia's drone deficit into an existential problem for the Donbass campaign. As of early April, Russia had expanded its unmanned systems forces to 101,000 personnel, with plans to reach 165,500 by the end of 2026. Those are impressive numbers on paper. But Russia's drone force is being built to operate primarily along the front line, using a system called the drone line that divides the battlefield into echelons extending up to 10 kilometers behind the contact line. Ukraine's middle-range systems are operating at 10 times that depth. Russia is building a wall, while Ukraine is building a weapon that flies over it. The Kremlin-affiliated mill bloggers are saying the quiet part out loud. One blogger associated with the Russian aerospace forces admitted that while Russia could theoretically increase glide bomb strikes from 10,000 to 15,000 or 16,000 per month, there are not enough aircraft or maintenance personnel to make it happen. Another complained that Russian forces are wasting bombs on low-value targets, striking basements housing individual infantrymen instead of concentrating on objectives that might actually change the battlefield. A third reported that Russian drone operators in the Huliapol direction are being pulled from their consoles and sent forward as assault infantry to fill gaps in units that have been ground down to skeletons. When you are using your drone pilots as cannon fodder, the strategic situation has moved well past desperation. Now layer in the manpower crisis. In the first 3 months of 2026, the Russian army lost 89,000 troops killed or seriously wounded. President Zelensky reported this at a press conference in late March, and it tracks with the numbers coming out of every independent tracking source. Russia's recruitment target for 2026 is 409,000 troops. In the first quarter, they managed roughly 80,000. That is a deficit of approximately 9,000 soldiers in 3 months, a shortfall that compounds with every week of high-intensity combat. According to The Economist and multiple Western intelligence services, total Russian military casualties since February 2022 have reached somewhere between 1.1 and 1.4 million, including between 230,000 and 430,000 dead. The Netherlands Military Intelligence and Security Service estimated in April 2026 that Russia has suffered about 1.2 million permanent losses, including more than 500,000 dead. These are staggering numbers by any historical standard. Russia is losing soldiers at a pace that exceeds the entire Soviet death toll in Afghanistan, not over a decade, but on a monthly basis. In December 2025,
A single month's losses exceeded the total Soviet casualties from 10 years of fighting in the Hindu Kush. British Defense Secretary John Healey confirmed in mid-April that Russia has been losing more soldiers than it can recruit for 4 consecutive months. Ukrainian Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov put numbers to the carnage. For every square kilometer Russia gains, it currently loses 254 soldiers on average across the theater. In Donetsk Oblast specifically, that number rises to 428 soldiers per square kilometer. And Ukrainian Brigadier General Pavlo Palisa, the deputy head of the president's office, has placed the Donetsk-specific figure at 316 soldiers per square kilometer captured. Run the arithmetic. Russia has approximately 6,000 square kilometers of Donetsk Oblast left to capture before it can claim the Donbass. At 316 casualties per square kilometer, that translates to 1.896 million additional casualties. At 428 per square kilometer, the number climbs to 2.568 million. Either figure is larger than Russia's total losses for the entire war to date. The Donbass, in other words, is not a campaign that Russia can complete by bleeding. It is a campaign that would require Russia to bleed itself to death, and then keep bleeding. Putin knows this. His generals know this. And yet the orders keep coming. In April, Kremlin Press Secretary Dmitry Peskov insisted that Russia had only 17 to 18% of the Donetsk People's Republic left to liberate, a framing designed to make the remaining territory sound like a manageable final push. Putin has set a new deadline of September 2026 for the capture of the entire Donbass. Ukrainian intelligence chief Vadim Skibitsky has confirmed this deadline exists. Everyone who has looked at the battlefield math agrees it is fantasy. Palisa said in early March that at the rate of advance Russia was making in January and February, it would need a year and a half to take Donetsk. That estimate was made before Russia's advance collapsed into net negative territory in April. A year and a half now looks wildly optimistic for Russia. The September 2026 deadline is not a military plan. It is a political demand dressed in a uniform, and the uniform does not fit. And then there is the Starlink factor, a development that has received less attention than it deserves. In February 2026, all Starlink satellite communication systems in and around Ukraine were limited to registered users only, effectively cutting off Russian forces that had been using stolen or acquired terminals. The impact was immediate and severe. Russian units lost the rapid coordination capabilities that Starlink had enabled, degrading their ability to direct drone operations, coordinate assaults, and communicate between echelons. An ISW assessment from the Oleksandrivka direction noted in May that Russian infantry activity had declined in part due to continued coordination issues after Russian forces lost their access to Starlink. The acting head of recruiting for a Ukrainian brigade in the area stated that while Russian forces have likely restored some basic communications, they have lost the faster decision-making capabilities that Starlink previously enabled. Losing Starlink didn't just slow Russia's offensive, it made every other problem worse. Drone operations became less coordinated. Assault timing became sloppier. Logistics became harder to synchronize. In a war where reaction time is measured in seconds, losing a few seconds of communication delay translates directly into additional casualties. Russia is trying to fight a 21st century drone war with a 20th century communication backbone, and it is showing. So what does Ukraine's plan actually look like? It has 3 layers, and they are all operating simultaneously. The first layer is the front line itself. The fortress belt, 12 years in the making, anchored on the cities of Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Kostantinivka, Drushkivka, and Dobropilya. Rivers, minefields, tank barriers, bunkers, and overlapping fields of drone fire. Every Russian assault that hits this belt burns soldiers at a rate that Russia cannot sustain. The cost per square kilometer keeps climbing because the defenses keep improving, because the drones keep multiplying, because the kill zones keep expanding. The second layer is the mid-range strike campaign. Drones reaching 100 to 160 kilometers behind the lines, hitting the supply arteries, the fuel depots, the ammunition stores, the air defense batteries, the communication towers. Every successful strike at this depth degrades the support structure for the frontline offensive. Soldiers who cannot be resupplied fight less effectively. Vehicles that cannot be refueled sit idle. Air defense systems that have been destroyed cannot protect against the next drone wave. This layer is what turns Russia's attrition problem from bad to potentially terminal. The third layer is Ukraine's deep strike campaign against Russian strategic infrastructure. Oil refineries as far as 1,500 kilometers from the front. In April 2026, there were at least 21 Ukrainian strikes on Russian oil refineries, export terminals, ships and pipeline pumping stations, the highest monthly total since December. Russia's crude processing rate fell to 4.69 million barrels a day, about 11 to 12% below early 2026 levels and roughly 18% below 2021 rates. This isn't just economic pressure. It is strategic strangulation. Russia's ability to fund the war, to pay the enormous signing bonuses that attract recruits, to maintain the industrial base that produces the weapons, all of it is being eroded by drones that fly further than Russia can defend against. These three layers work together as a system. Frontline attrition burns Russia's soldiers faster than they can be replaced. Mid-range strikes degrade the support infrastructure that surviving soldiers need to fight effectively. Deep strikes attack the economic engine that funds the entire enterprise. Each layer makes the other two more effective. A Russian unit that has lost its supply line dies faster on the front. A Russian air defense system that has been destroyed opens the corridor for the drone that will hit the next supply depot. A refinery that is burning means less fuel for the trucks that carry the ammunition that the frontline soldiers need to survive. Ukraine is not trying to defeat Russia in a single battle. It is building a machine that converts Russian offensive momentum into Russian self-destruction. The more Russia pushes, the more it feeds the machine. And the machine is hungry. That is why Russia's net territorial losses in April are so significant. They represent the first visible evidence that the machine is working. Russia intensified its assaults. It launched 1,384 combat engagements in the week leading up to April 27, the highest number in 2 months. And it lost ground. The correlation between maximum effort and negative results is the signature of a force that has been strategically outmaneuvered even as it maintains tactical aggression. The next few months will determine whether this trend becomes irreversible. Russian forces are preparing for larger mechanized assaults as the weather improves. If those assaults hit the same defenses that stopped them in March and April, the casualty figures will spike further, and the recruitment shortfall will widen. If Ukraine can sustain and expand its mid-range strike campaign, Russia's logistical backbone in occupied Donetsk will continue to degrade. And if Russia's September deadline comes and goes without the Donbass falling, which every available indicator suggests is certain, then the Kremlin will face a choice that it has been avoiding since 2022, accept that the Donbass cannot be taken by force, or continue feeding soldiers into a machine that turns them into statistics. 20 Russian soldiers held out in the Kupiansk city hospital for months after infiltrating the city in December 2025. Encircled, cut off, surviving on whatever they could scavenge, they became a symbol of Russia's infiltration doctrine, proof that small units could penetrate Ukrainian lines and hold. Then, in early May, a Ukrainian airstrike destroyed the hospital. Most of the surviving personnel were killed. A Russian mill blogger reported that the soldiers fought their last battle and held their positions until the very end. He meant it as a tribute to their courage. But it reads as something else entirely. 20 men, trapped for 5 months in a ruined hospital in a city they could not hold, dying in the rubble of a building that no longer served any strategic purpose. That is the Donbass campaign in miniature. Brave soldiers. Impossible orders. A fortress that does not break. Ukraine is not liberating the Donbass with a single dramatic offensive. It is liberating it by making the occupation cost more than Russia can afford. Every drone strike on a supply truck 100 kilometers behind the lines is a liberation. Every failed infiltration at Kostiantynivka is a liberation. Every month where casualties exceed recruitment is a liberation. The territory will follow when the army that holds it can no longer sustain itself. And that process has already begun. The radar operator at Bandar Menja stared at his screen and saw nothing where something should have been. At 0237 local time, 90 miles north of the Iranian oil terminal at Karg Island, the entire southern air defense sector of the Islamic Republic of Iran had just gone dark. The first Scalp cruise missile was already 11 minutes into its terrain-hugging flight, and the Emirati pilots who launched it were turning for home before Iran knew a war had started. Shift 340 miles south to Al Dhafra Air Base, just outside Abu Dhabi. 8 UAE Rafale F-4 fighters sat on the apron 90 seconds earlier with their canopies already closing. Each aircraft carried 2 Black Shaheen cruise missiles, the Emirati designation for the Scalp EG, a 2,900-pound stealth-shaped cruise missile with a published range of 250 miles and a unit cost of roughly $3 million. The Rafale F-4 itself runs about $115 million per airframe. The terminal they were about to hit, by contrast, handles 90% of Iran's crude oil exports and pumps an estimated $1.5 billion of revenue per week into the Iranian treasury. 8 jets, 16 missiles. 1 island holding up the entire Iranian economy. The lead pilot pushed the throttles. Wheels up. Radio silence. Shift 1,100 miles west to Washington, D.C. In the Situation Room, the president had already signed off on the operation 14 hours earlier under a classified annex to a maximum pressure directive. The public message had been delivered the previous afternoon on the South Lawn, when Donald Trump told reporters that if Tehran did not reopen the Strait of Hormuz to inspections within 72 hours, quote, they're next. Tehran assumed he meant American bombers flying out of Diego Garcia. Tehran assumed wrong. What the Iranian Air Defense Command did not know was that the operation was never going to be American. It was going to be Emirati hardware, French missiles, American satellite queuing, and Israeli electronic warfare data, fused over a private link the Iranians did not believe existed. The whole point was deniable plausibility, and the deniability was already collapsing because the strike package had launched 30 seconds ahead of schedule.
Shift back to Karg Island.
The island is 16 miles off the Iranian coast in the northern Persian Gulf, a coral outcrop barely 5 miles long, ringed by the largest oil-loading jetties on Earth. 2 crude terminals, T Jetty and Sea Island, can berth 14 supertankers simultaneously. On a normal night, roughly $200 million of crude is in the pipes at any given moment. Tonight was not a normal night. Tonight, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard had repositioned a full battery of S-300 PMU-2 launchers to the eastern ridge of the island, along with a single Bavar 373 battery brought down from Bushehr the week before. The Bavar 373, Iran's domestically produced long-range surface-to-air system, claims a detection range of 260 kilometers, or roughly 160 miles, against large aircraft. Against a Scalp cruise missile flying 100 feet over the Gulf at 600 miles per hour, it claims considerably less. The radar plot the Iranians had drawn assumed any attack would come from the west, from American carriers in the Red Sea or bombers from Al Udeid in Qatar. The Bavar 373 antennas were oriented accordingly. The missiles were coming from the south. Shift 95 miles southeast to the lead Rafale, callsign Falcon 1. The pilot, a 41-year-old Emirati colonel with 2,800 flight hours, watched his tactical display update in real time from an E-7 Wedgetail orbiting over Saudi airspace.
2 waypoints.
Release Point Alpha at 90 miles from target. Release Point Bravo at 75 miles.
He hit Alpha. 2 missiles dropped.
Engines lit.
Gone.
Shift to the missile itself. The Scalp EG is 17 feet of stealth-shaped composite, weighing 2,900 pounds, with a 990-pound Broach tandem warhead designed to punch through hardened concrete before detonating. It cruises at 600 miles per hour, roughly the speed of a commercial airliner, but at an altitude low enough that any boat captain in the Gulf would mistake it for a low-flying gull at night. It uses terrain reference navigation, GPS, and a thermal imaging seeker that compares the target to a stored 3D model in the final 10 seconds of flight. The Iranians had practiced for ballistic missiles. They had not practiced for this.
Falcon 1 turned south.
Falcons 2 through 8 repeated the sequence at 30-second intervals. 16 missiles in the air. Combined cost, $48 million. Target replacement cost, north of $20 billion when you count the oil, the infrastructure, and the export revenue. Shift 1,400 miles north to a Russian-built radar station outside Shiraz. The technician on duty saw the first faint return at 0241. He flagged it as a likely surface contact, a fishing dhow drifting on the radar floor. By the time his supervisor walked over to look, the contact had split into 4.
Then 8. Then 16.
The supervisor reached for the red phone. The red phone was already ringing.
Shift back to Karg.
The first Scalp came in from the southeast at 110 feet, popped up to 400 feet at the 4-mile mark, and angled down into the central pumping manifold of T Jetty. The 990-pound warhead penetrated 3 feet of reinforced concrete before detonating inside the primary crude distribution header. The explosion lifted the entire jetty roof 80 feet into the air. Burning crude began pouring back through ruptured pipes at a rate of 40,000 barrels per hour. 4 seconds later, the second missile hit Sea Island. 6 seconds later, the third hit the desalination plant that supplied the entire island workforce. The Bavar 373 battery commander finally got a lock on missile number 4. He fired 2 Sayyad 4 interceptors. Each Sayyad 4 costs Iran roughly $1 million to produce. The first interceptor missed cleanly. The second proximity fused on a decoy radar return generated by an Israeli-built jammer pod hanging under Falcon 3, 120 miles away. 2 interceptors expended. 1 Israeli jammer pod retained. Iran was about to learn what happens when you bring 1980s Soviet doctrine to a fight engineered by people who read every word of the Soviet manuals first. Shift to the S-300 battery on the eastern ridge. The battery commander, a colonel of the IRGC Aerospace Force, had 8 missiles ready. He launched 4 at the cluster of inbound contacts. The 48 N6E2 interceptor screams off the rail at Mach 6, 6 times the speed of sound, climbs to 90,000 feet, and noses over. Against a fighter jet, it is devastating. Against a sea-skimming cruise missile masked by the radar horizon of the island itself, it is searching for a target that, from the radar's perspective, does not yet exist. 3 of the 4 interceptors flew their full kinematic envelope and self-destructed over open water. The 4th got a partial lock and clipped the wing of an inbound Scalp. The Scalp cartwheeled into the Gulf 800 yards short of the target. Cost of the interception, roughly $4 million. Cost of the missile destroyed, roughly $3 million. Cost of being 1 for 16, incalculable. Shift 16 miles back to the Iranian mainland, to the command bunker at Geneva. The general, staring at the threat board, watched the icons multiply faster than his operators could read them out. He ordered every fighter at Bushehr scrambled. 4 F-4 Phantoms, airframes older than every pilot flying them, began the long taxi to the runway. The lead Phantom rotated at 0247. By 0247 and 30 seconds, the last scalp had already detonated inside the Central Petroleum Storage Farm.
Shift to the storage farm. 12 tanks,
each holding 1 million barrels of crude. The warhead found tank number 3. Tank 3 ignited tank 4.
Tank 4 breached tank 5.
The fireball was visible from the Qatari coast, 180 miles away, where an American satellite operator filing nightly weather imagery suddenly had a daytime photograph at 3 in the morning. Shift back to Falcon 1, now 200 miles south, descending toward Al Dhafra. The colonel's radio crackled. A single word from AWACS.
Splash.
He acknowledged with a single click of the transmit button. The aircraft behind him repeated the click in sequence. 8 clicks.
8 Rafales.
0 losses. 0 radar locks achieved by Iranian air defense for longer than 11 seconds.
Shift back to Washington.
The president was handed a single sheet of paper. He read it. He looked up at the room. He said, "Tell Tehran the next one isn't deniable." The note went out through back channels at 0319 Eastern Time. The Iranians had it by 0321. Shift to Tehran, to the office of the Supreme National Security Council, where a hastily convened emergency meeting was already in its 14th minute. The deputy commander of the IRGC Aerospace Force was attempting to explain how a country with no operational fifth-generation aircraft, no stealth bombers, and no aircraft carriers had just removed 90% of Iran's oil export capacity in 11 minutes. He explained it badly because there was no good way to explain it. The honest answer was that the UAE had spent 20 years quietly building the most capable small air force in the Gulf, that France had sold them missiles the United States had publicly opposed in 1998, and that Iran had assumed for 2 decades the Emiratis would never use them. The Emiratis had just used them. Iran's options narrowed in real time. Close the Strait of Hormuz, and the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar would treat it as an act of war. Strike Al Dhafra directly, and the United States, with 3,500 personnel on the base, would respond inside an hour. Do nothing, and lose $1.5 billion of weekly revenue indefinitely. Shift to Karg Island, now 47 minutes after the first impact. The fires had merged into a single column of black smoke 18,000 feet tall. Satellite imagery showed both jetties structurally collapsed. The central pumping manifold was gone. The storage farm was a crater. Initial damage assessments estimated repair time at 14 to 18 months. Initial revenue loss estimated at $90 billion over that period. The total cost to the UAE for the operation, including missiles, fuel, and crew hours, came to approximately $52 million. Iran had just paid roughly $1.7 billion per minute to learn that the radar facing the wrong direction is the same as no radar at all. Shift to the runway at Al Dhafra. Falcon 1 taxied to the apron at 0341 local time. The colonel cut the engines. The crew chief climbed the ladder. The colonel removed his helmet. He said 3 words to the crew chief. The crew chief later told a friend, who later told a journalist, who later printed it. The 3 words were, "It worked perfectly." Across the Gulf, on Karg Island, the fires would burn for another 9 days. If you enjoyed this video, check out our other video on Iran's failed S-300 deployments. Bye for now. At 2:14 local time, an Israeli Air Force F-35 Ayadir dropped below 200 feet over the Persian Gulf, 40 miles south of Bandar Abbas, and released a payload that had never been used in combat before. The pilot didn't see the target. He didn't need to. The aircraft's mission computer had already confirmed coordinates transmitted from a source the pilot would never be briefed on, locked the weapon, and initiated release sequencing before the jet even crossed into Iranian airspace. The weapon fell for 11 seconds. Then its engine ignited and it disappeared from the pilot's heads-up display entirely. He pulled into a 7G climbing turn back toward tanker airspace.
His part was done.
The weapon's part was just beginning. 6 seconds later, 190 miles to the north, an operator at Iran's Karg Island oil terminal noticed something unusual on his monitoring screen. A pressure reading in the main crude distribution manifold had dropped by 4%. He noted it in his log. He assumed it was a sensor fault. Karg Island processes roughly 90% of Iran's crude oil exports. On a normal day, 5 million barrels pass through its loading systems. This was not going to be a normal day. 1,200 miles to the west, At Nevatim Air Base in the Negev Desert, the operations center was running at full capacity. 47 personnel occupied stations in a room roughly the size of a basketball court. The air smelled like coffee and static electricity. 3 screens along the far wall displayed feeds from assets the Israeli Air Force doesn't publicly acknowledge having in theater. One of them showed a live infrared image of Karg Island from 62,000 feet. The operator watching it said nothing. He just marked a timestamp. 2:14 and 31 seconds. 700 miles southeast, in the waters off Fujairah, 3 commercial supertankers sat at anchor waiting for loading schedules. Each one carried roughly 2 million barrels of capacity. Each one was empty. They had been empty for 11 days. The shipping companies that owned them had received quiet advisories from their insurance underwriters to delay Persian Gulf transits. No reason was given. No reason needed to be. When Lloyd's of London tells you to wait, you wait. And in Washington, D.C., where it was still 5:14 in the evening of the previous day, a statement had been drafted but not yet released. The statement concerned the Strait of Hormuz. It contained exactly one sentence that would rearrange global oil markets within hours of its publication. The sentence had been reviewed by the National Security Council, the Secretary of Defense, and the President himself. It read, in part, that the United States would consider any hostile interdiction of commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz as an act requiring immediate and proportional military response. The word proportional was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. It was about to do more. Back over the Persian Gulf, the weapon released from the F-35 I had covered 140 miles in just under 4 minutes. It was a variant of the Rampage air-to-surface missile, a supersonic precision munition with a range of approximately 190 miles and a warhead designed not for blast damage but for structural penetration. Think of a telephone pole made of tungsten and high explosive moving at Mach 2.4. It doesn't need to destroy everything. It just needs to hit the right thing. At 2:18 local time, it hit the right thing. The target was not a military installation. It was not a nuclear facility. It was not a government building. It was a 36-inch high-pressure crude oil pipeline junction at the southern edge of Karg Island's Tank Farm No. 3. This junction connected the main export pipeline to 3 of the island's 6 single-point mooring buoys, the floating loading stations where tankers connect to take on crude. Without this junction, those 3 buoys were dead metal in the water. Half of Karg Island's export capacity disappeared in a moment measured in milliseconds. The explosion itself was modest. A flash. A pressure wave that broke windows in a control building 400 meters away. Then a fire that burned at 1,100 degrees for the next 14 hours. The operator who had noted the pressure drop 4 minutes earlier now had a very different problem on his screen. He wasn't looking at a sensor fault. He was looking at zero flow across the entire southern distribution network. He reached for the emergency communications panel. The line was dead. That wasn't an accident. 70 seconds before the Rampage missile reached its target, an Israeli cyber operation that had been dormant inside Karg Island's communications infrastructure for an estimated 19 months activated a prepositioned payload. It didn't destroy the communication system. That would have been obvious and quickly repaired. Instead, it introduced a 5,000 millisecond delay on all outgoing signals from the island's primary and secondary communications nodes. 5 seconds. That doesn't sound like much. In the next 90 minutes, it would be enough. 320 miles to the northwest, a second strike was arriving. This one came from the Mediterranean. 2 Israeli F-15I RAM aircraft operating from a position over northern Syria had launched 4 Delilah cruise missiles 12 minutes earlier. The Delilah is slower than the Rampage, subsonic, about 600 miles per hour. But it has a capability the Rampage doesn't. It can loiter. It can circle a target area for up to 30 minutes, waiting for updated targeting data before committing to its final attack run. These 4 Delilahs were not circling. They were inbound and locked. Their target was the Abadan oil refinery complex in southwestern Iran, one of the oldest and most important refineries in the country. Abadan processes 400,000 barrels of crude per day. It sits on the Shat al-Arab waterway, 11 miles from the Iraqi border. The Delilahs were coming in from the west, below 100 feet, following the river. Iranian air defense coverage in Khuzestan province is dense. On paper, the province hosts 3 battalions of S-300 PMU-2 long-range surface-to-air missile systems, 2 batteries of Bavar 373 indigenous air defense systems, and multiple short-range point defense installations. On any other night, detecting 4 subsonic cruise missiles crossing the border at low altitude would have been difficult but possible, given the radar coverage overlaps designed into the network. On this night, it was impossible. Because at 2:11 local time, 3 minutes before the first rampage hit Karg Island, every early warning radar in a 200-mile radius of Abadan experienced what would later be described as a catastrophic synchronization failure. This was the second cyber operation, and it was significantly more aggressive than the first. Rather than introducing delays, this payload attacked the timing protocols that allow multiple radar installations to coordinate their coverage and hand off tracking data between stations. Without synchronized timing, each radar station still functioned individually. Each one could still detect objects in its own sector. But none of them could talk to each other. And none of them could pass targeting data to the missile batteries that depended on that information to engage threats. Each radar operator saw pieces of the picture. None of them saw all of it. The 4 Delilahs threaded through the gaps like water through a cracked dam. At 2:22 local time, the first Delilah struck the main atmospheric distillation column at Abadan's Unit 2 processing facility. The second hit the adjacent crude desalting plant. The third struck a 200,000-barrel floating roof storage tank. The fourth missed its intended target by 40 meters and detonated on a maintenance road.
The first 3 were enough.
Within 6 minutes, fires were burning across an area the size of 4 football fields. Secondary explosions in the desalting plant sent burning hydrocarbons into the drainage system that fed into the Shat al-Arab waterway. A black cloud visible from Basra, Iraq, 30 miles away, began to climb. 600 miles to the east, Iran's response was already in motion. But it was the wrong response. At 2:16, 2 minutes after the Karg Island strike, Iran's Supreme National Security Council received initial reports of an explosion on the island. The information was fragmentary because of the communications delay. But the SNSC had anticipated an Israeli strike against its nuclear program for months. Every contingency plan, every prepositioned response, every retaliatory option was built around that assumption. The assumption was that any Israeli attack would target Natanz, Isfahan, or Fordow. The nuclear triad. Every wargame they had run, every scenario they had planned for, started with those 3 locations. At 2:19, a duty officer in Tehran ordered a general air defense alert across all nuclear-associated facilities. S-300 batteries at Natanz powered to full readiness. Bavar 373 units at Isfahan began sweep scanning. Fighter squadrons at Mehrabad and Tabriz were ordered to immediate alert status. Within 12 minutes, Iran had its most sophisticated air defense umbrella active and scanning. It was covering the wrong targets. No Israeli aircraft were within 400 miles of any nuclear facility.
That was the point.
1,200 miles from Tehran, aboard the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower operating in the Gulf of Oman, the Carrier Strike Group's intelligence center was watching everything.
They weren't participating. Not yet.
Their role, for now, was to observe and to maintain a posture that the Pentagon described internally as conspicuous readiness. The Eisenhower had 2 squadrons of F divided by a -18E divided by F Super Hornets, a squadron of EA-18G Growlers electronic warfare aircraft, and an air wing that had been at elevated readiness for 9 days. Conspicuous readiness meant that Iranian intelligence could see the carrier group, could see its aircraft on the flight deck, could detect the electronic emissions of a strike group preparing for operations. It was meant to be visible. It was meant to create doubt. If Iran retaliated against Israel, would the Americans join? The answer was supposed to be unclear. Unclear is more powerful than certain. What Iran's intelligence services could not see was what was 200 miles behind the Eisenhower. 3 Ohio-class guided missile submarines. Each one carrying 154 Tomahawk cruise missiles. That's 462 cruise missiles in a space roughly the size of a small parking lot, sitting quietly at 400 feet below the surface of the Arabian Sea. They had been in position for 6 days. They had received no launch orders. They had received one message, repeated daily for the last 4 days. 4 words: maintain current posture, stand by. Back in Washington, the statement about the Strait of Hormuz was released at 5:47 p.m. Eastern Time. Within 11 minutes, Brent crude futures spiked $14 per barrel. Within 30 minutes, the spike hit $22. Trading algorithms that had been watching for keywords including Hormuz, military response, and proportional triggered automated buying across every major commodity exchange simultaneously. By the time human traders at the London IC exchange started their morning 6 hours later, oil was at $127 per barrel and climbing. 24 hours earlier it had been at $89.
This was story 1.
Israeli strikes on Iranian oil infrastructure. American threats regarding the strait. A regional crisis with global energy implications. Every news network on the planet was running this story by 3 a.m. local time. Satellites were being repositioned. Analysts were being woken up. Retired generals were sitting in studio chairs explaining what they thought would happen next. What they didn't know was that the oil infrastructure was the distraction. The real operation had started 11 hours earlier, at 3 p.m. local time on the previous afternoon, and it had nothing to do with missiles, aircraft, or pipelines. At 3:02 p.m. the previous day, an Iranian-flagged container ship named the Shari Cord, a 40,000-ton vessel operating a regular route between Bandar Abbas and the port of Latakia in Syria, suffered what its crew reported as a catastrophic engine room failure approximately 15 miles inside the Strait of Hormuz.
The vessel lost propulsion. It began to drift.
The crew deployed an emergency anchor in one of the most congested shipping channels on Earth. The Strait of Hormuz at its narrowest point is 21 miles wide. The shipping lanes used by tanker traffic are 2 miles wide in each direction, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. A 40,000-ton ship sitting dead in the water in one of those lanes is the maritime equivalent of a jackknifed tractor-trailer on a two-lane highway. Traffic began to stack up almost immediately. By 4 p.m., 6 tankers were holding positions south of the disabled vessel, waiting for tugs. By 6 p.m., the number was 14. By midnight, 23 commercial vessels of various types were either holding position, diverting around the obstruction, or anchored in designated waiting areas. Iranian port authorities at Bandar Abbas offered tug assistance. The tugs arrived at 7:30 p.m.
They connected lines.
They attempted to move the Shari Cord.
The ship didn't budge.
The tugs reported that the vessel's anchor chain appeared to be fouled on something on the seabed. The anchor couldn't be retrieved.
The ship couldn't be towed.
Nobody in any Western intelligence service flagged this as unusual. Container ships break down. Anchors get fouled.
It happens.
The Strait of Hormuz experiences an average of 3 significant shipping disruptions per month.
This was routine. Annoying but routine. It was not routine.
The Shari Cord's engine room failure had been manufactured. The anchor was not fouled on the seabed. It was functioning exactly as intended. The ship's purpose was not to transit to Latakia. Its purpose was to sit precisely where it was sitting for precisely as long as it was sitting there. Because directly beneath the Shari Cord, on the floor of the strait at a depth of 80 meters, sat something that had been placed there 14 weeks earlier by an Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy midget submarine.
It was a mine.
But not a conventional naval mine. It was a rising mine, a weapon that sits on the seabed and upon activation, releases a torpedo that ascends to intercept a target passing overhead. This particular variant was the EM-52, a Chinese-designed system that Iran had been suspected of possessing since 2015 but had never confirmed. The EM-52 can engage targets in water up to 200 meters deep. Its torpedo component has a range of approximately 10 miles. There wasn't just one. There were 6. Spaced at 1,500-meter intervals along the shipping lanes. The Shari Cord was sitting on top of one of them, not because the ship was part of the mine deployment, but because the ship's position was intended to force tanker traffic into a predictable diversion pattern. When ships can't use the normal channel, they use the alternate channel. The alternate channel ran directly over 4 of the other 5 mines. It was a kill box, and 23 ships were slowly being herded into it. The American statement about the strait was not a coincidence. It was based on intelligence. 96 hours earlier, a signals intelligence platform operating from a facility in Bahrain had intercepted a burst transmission from a known IRGC Navy Command node to 3 fast attack craft bases along the Iranian coast. The transmission was encrypted, but its structure matched a pattern that NSA analysts had catalogued 4 years earlier during a previous escalation. The pattern was associated with mine warfare activation.
Not deployment. Activation.
The mines were already in the water. What the transmission ordered was the arming sequence. A second intercept, from a different source, provided partial geographic coordinates. Those coordinates were in the Strait of Hormuz. They were verified within 12 hours by an underwater drone launched from a Virginia-class submarine operating in the Gulf of Oman. The drone, an autonomous system called Razorback, covered 45 miles of seabed and returned with sonar imagery confirming 6 bottom-mounted objects consistent with EM-52 mine profiles. That intelligence went from Bahrain to CENTCOM in Tampa to the Pentagon to the White House in less than 4 hours. The presidential statement about the strait was drafted the same day. The timing of its release, simultaneous with the Israeli strikes, oil prices climbing. That crisis was loud, photogenic, and impossible to ignore. The invisible crisis was 6 mines in the Strait of Hormuz, a dead container ship sitting on top of one of them, and 23 vessels slowly repositioning into a pattern that would give Iran the ability to shut down 21% of the world's daily oil supply in under 3 minutes. In Tehran, the Supreme National Security Council was in emergency session.
The room was divided. The strikes on Karg Island and Abadan were an act of war. There was no ambiguity about that. The damage to Karg alone would reduce Iran's oil export capacity by an estimated 40% for a minimum of 6 months. Abadan would take longer. The economic impact was staggering. Iran's oil revenue for the current fiscal year was projected at approximately $50 billion. 40% of export capacity gone meant roughly $20 billion in lost revenue. Annual. For at least a year. The math was not complicated. The IRGC commander present in the session argued for immediate activation of the Strait contingency. The mines were armed. The fast attack craft were loaded with anti-ship missiles. 62 missile boats, each carrying 2 to 4 C-802 anti-ship cruise missiles, were dispersed along the Iranian coastline between Bandar Abbas and Jask. The total missile count exceeded 200. Against commercial shipping, those numbers were overwhelming. Tankers don't have countermeasures. They don't maneuver. They're 1,000-foot steel boxes moving at 15 knots. Even a 20% hit rate would mean 40 missiles finding targets. The strait would be closed within hours. Oil would hit $200 per barrel. Maybe $250. The economic damage to the West would dwarf what Israel had just done to Iran. The foreign minister argued the opposite. The American statement had changed the calculus. Closing the strait would not trigger an American diplomatic protest. It would trigger a military response. And unlike previous administrations that had drawn red lines and then negotiated around them, this White House had positioned assets that made the threat credible. The Eisenhower strike group was visible. The statement was public. The word proportional gave the Americans legal and political cover to do almost anything. What the foreign minister didn't know, and what the IRGC commander didn't know, was what was 200 miles behind the Eisenhower. Those 3 Ohio-class submarines. 462 Tomahawk cruise missiles. Proportional is an interesting word when you have 462 cruise missiles available. The debate in Tehran lasted 47 minutes. The decision was to activate Phase 1 of the Strait contingency but not Phase 2. Phase 1 meant the fast attack craft would deploy from their bases and take up pre-assigned positions along the coast, visible to American surveillance, creating a threat posture. The mines would remain armed but not triggered. Phase 2, the actual mining and missile attacks on shipping, would be held in reserve as a deterrent. The logic was that the threat of closing the strait was almost as powerful as actually closing it, and significantly less likely to result in an American attack. It was a reasonable calculation. It had one flaw. The flaw was that Israel already knew about Phase 1. They knew because the communications network that carried the SNSC's orders to IRGC Navy Command was compromised. Not the encryption. The metadata. Israeli signals intelligence didn't know what the order said, but they knew when they were sent, from where, to whom, and the response patterns they generated. When 62 missile boats began leaving their berths within 20 minutes of the SNSC session ending, the pattern matched what Israeli intelligence had predicted for a strait closure posture. At 3:40 local time, roughly 90 minutes after the first strike on Karg Island, the Israeli operation entered its second phase. This phase had no missiles, no aircraft, and no explosions. It was conducted entirely in the electromagnetic spectrum. 4 Israeli Gulfstream G550 aircraft modified for signals intelligence and electronic warfare, known as the Nakhon Shavat and Nakhon item, had been orbiting in a racetrack pattern over the Red Sea at 41,000 feet since midnight. They had been silent until now. At 3:40, all 4 aircraft activated their electronic warfare suites simultaneously. The effect was immediate. Iranian naval communications along the entire southern coastline degraded by approximately 70%. The 62 fast attack craft that had just deployed from their bases suddenly couldn't talk to their command authority with any reliability. Some lost communications entirely. Others received garbled fragments. The boats were designed to operate independently if necessary, but their commanders had trained for a coordinated missile saturation attack. Without coordination, each boat was a single unit with 2 to 4 missiles. Individually, they were annoying. Collectively, they were devastating. Israel had just turned collectively into individually. At the same time, 400 miles to the east, something happened that nobody in Tehran or Jerusalem had planned for. The Shari cord, the container ship sitting dead in the Strait of Hormuz, moved. Not because the tugs pulled it free. Because its anchor chain broke. Or more precisely, because the anchor chain was cut. A U.S. Navy explosive ordnance disposal team operating from a rigid-hull inflatable boat that had been staged from the USS Nitsa, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer operating nearby, had placed a small-shaped charge on the anchor chain at a depth of 30 meters. The charge detonated at 3:38 was not a coincidence. Someone had coordinated this.
The Shari Cord Gambit was burned. But the mines were still in the water. And the mines were still armed. In Tampa, at CENTCOM headquarters, the mine problem was now the priority. 6 EM, 52 rising mines in the world's most important shipping chokepoint. Each one capable of killing a supertanker. The standard approach to mine clearance is methodical. You send mine countermeasure vessels, MH-53EC Dragon helicopters towing minesweeping gear, unmanned underwater vehicles to locate and neutralize each mine individually.
It takes days. Sometimes weeks.
The strait couldn't be closed for weeks. Every day of closure cost the global economy roughly $2.5 billion. The non-standard approach was faster.
And riskier.
At 4:15 local time, AP-8A Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft operating from Naval Support Activity Bahrain arrived over the strait at 25,000 feet. It was carrying sonobuoys, expendable underwater sensors that could be dropped from the aircraft to create an acoustic picture of the seabed. Over the next 40 minutes, the Poseidon dropped 36 sonobuoys in a grid pattern covering the area identified by the Razorback drone's earlier survey. The sonobuoy data was relayed in real time to the NHTSA, which had the most advanced mine warfare software package in the strike group. Simultaneously, 2 MH-60S Seahawk helicopters launched from the Eisenhower carrying airborne mine neutralization systems, essentially remote-controlled underwater vehicles with explosive charges that could be guided to a mine and detonated. Each helicopter carried 2 neutralization vehicles.
4 vehicles. 6 mines.
The math wasn't perfect. 50 miles to the south, a second underwater drone was launched from the Virginia-class submarine. This one wasn't mapping. It was carrying 4 lightweight charges specifically designed for bottom mine neutralization. The drone's transit time to the minefield was estimated at 90 minutes.
Too long for the first pass.
The helicopters would have to do what they could with 4 vehicles and hope the submarine's drone arrived in time for the remaining mines. At 4:55 local time, the first airborne mine neutralization vehicle reached its target. The mine was sitting in 75 meters of water, partially buried in silt. The neutralization vehicle positioned itself within 2 meters of the mine and detonated. The explosion was felt on the surface as a dull thump. Sonobuoy data confirmed the mine was destroyed.
1 down, 5 to go.
The second vehicle reached its target at 5:03. Successful detonation.
2 down.
The third vehicle experienced a guidance malfunction at 5:10 and drifted off course. The operator on the Seahawk attempted to regain control. The vehicle's battery died at 5:14. It sank to the seabed, useless. 3 vehicles expended.
2 mines destroyed. 1 failed.
The fourth and final vehicle was deployed at 5:18 toward the third mine. Successful detonation at 5:24.
3 mines neutralized. 3 remaining.
The helicopters had nothing left. The submarine drone was still 40 minutes out.
40 minutes.
In those 40 minutes, 3 armed mines sat in the shipping lanes of the Strait of Hormuz. 3 mines that could each destroy a supertanker. 3 mines that the Iranian IRGC Navy still had the ability to trigger remotely. And in Tehran, the argument about Phase 2 was starting again. The IRGC commander now had new information. The Americans had moved the Shari Cord. The Americans were actively clearing the mines. The Iranian contingency was being dismantled in real time. If Phase 2 was going to happen, it needed to happen now, before the remaining mines were neutralized. The window was closing. 62 missile boats were in position, though many had degraded communications. The 3 remaining mines were armed and could be command detonated. The foreign minister's counter-argument was simpler now. The Americans were clearing the mines. That meant the Americans knew about the mines. That meant the American threat about the strait was not hypothetical. It was operational. If Iran triggered those mines or launched anti-ship missiles at commercial shipping, the response would not be a statement. It would be 462 Tomahawk cruise missiles. And those would not be aimed at oil infrastructure. They would be aimed at every IRGC Navy base, every missile storage facility, every command center, and every fast attack craft that could be located. The IRGC Navy would cease to exist as a functional force in approximately 90 minutes. There was also the question of China. China buys roughly 27% of Iran's oil exports. China had not been consulted about the strait contingency. China would not appreciate having its energy supply interrupted by an Iranian decision made in the heat of a crisis. Beijing's ambassador had already called twice. He had not been put through to anyone with decision-making authority. That was a mistake that would have consequences regardless. But one of the commercial tanker's 3 nautical miles, the aircraft carrier was already on fire when the order came through. Not the Reagan itself.
Not yet.
But one of the commercial tankers 3 nautical miles off the port bow was venting a column of black smoke so thick it bent the horizon, and for about 90 seconds every watchstander on the bridge of the USS Ronald Reagan thought they were looking at the opening minutes of a war they hadn't been briefed on.
They weren't.
The tanker was a Panamanian-flagged chemical carrier called the Delos Prosperity, 620 feet long, and what it was venting was the result of an engine room fire that had started 11 minutes earlier when a fuel transfer valve failed. The crew of 23 was already at their muster stations.
The fire was contained.
It was, by any operational definition, someone else's problem. But the smoke was everyone's problem because it was drifting southeast across the traffic separation scheme in the Strait of Hormuz at 8 knots, laying a gray-brown curtain across 2 miles of navigable waterway, and that curtain was about to become the backdrop for the worst miscalculation the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy had made in 30 years. The Ronald Reagan, CVN-76, Nimitz-class nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, 1,092 feet long, 97,000 tons full load, was transiting the strait on a Wednesday morning that should have been routine. The ship was eastbound, heading out of the Persian Gulf into the Gulf of Oman, running at 18 knots through water that was 200 feet deep and the color of poured concrete. The air wing wasn't flying. The weather was 104 degrees with visibility dropping because of the smoke, and the strait was doing what the strait always does, trying to kill everyone in it through sheer geometric inconvenience. 34 miles wide at the narrowest point, 2 miles of inbound lane, 2 miles of outbound lane, 2 miles of separation zone, and crammed into those lanes on this particular morning, 9 commercial tankers, 14 cargo vessels, 2 container ships, 6 dhows of various registration, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 140 small craft contacts that the Spy-6 V1 radar aboard the escort destroyer USS John Finn, DDG-113, was dutifully tracking as it steamed 3 nautical miles ahead of the Reagan on the threat axis. The John Finn was an Arleigh Burke-class Flight 3 destroyer, the newest variant, carrying the AN/Spy-6 V1 air and missile defense radar, which represented a quantum leap over the older Spy-1D. The SPY-6 used gallium nitride transmit/receive modules that gave it roughly 35 times the sensitivity of its predecessor. It could detect a target with a radar cross-section of 0.1 square meters at ranges exceeding 200 nautical miles. It could track ballistic missiles in the upper atmosphere while simultaneously maintaining a surface picture dense enough to count fishing boats. It was, by a considerable margin, the most capable naval radar ever put to sea on a destroyer hull. And on this particular morning, it was staring north into the Iranian coastline, painting every square foot of water between Keshem Island and the Musandam Peninsula, and the picture it was painting was about to get very crowded. On the Reagan's flag bridge, Rear Admiral Catherine Harlow, commander of Carrier Strike Group 7, was halfway through her second cup of coffee and reviewing the morning intel brief. The brief mentioned increased IRGC Navy activity at Bandar Abbas over the past 72 hours. It mentioned that Iranian state media had been running footage of fast attack craft exercises for 3 days straight, which was the kind of signal that usually preceded either a genuine provocation or a domestic propaganda cycle. The brief assessed probability of a harassment approach at elevated, probability of a kinetic engagement at low. Harlow read both assessments, noted the delta between them, and called down to the Combat Direction Center to ask a question that would prove more important than anything else she did that day. She asked what the MQ-4C Triton was showing. The MQ-4C Triton is a high-altitude, long-endurance unmanned surveillance aircraft built by Northrop Grumman. It has a wingspan of 131 feet, larger than a Boeing 757, and it operates at altitudes above 50,000 feet for missions lasting more than 24 hours. Its primary sensor is the AN/ZPY-3 multifunction active sensor, a 360-degree active electronically scanned array radar that can surveil more than 2 million square nautical miles in a single mission. It also carries an electro-optical/infrared sensor suite and an automatic identification system receiver. The Navy operates it specifically for maritime domain awareness, which is a polite way of saying it watches the ocean and tells you everything that's moving on it. The Triton orbiting over the northern Gulf that morning had been on station since 2200 the previous night. Its radar had been building a comprehensive surface picture for over 8 hours, layering pass after pass into a track history so detailed that analysts at the Maritime Operations Center in Bahrain could see not just where every vessel was, but where it had been, how fast it had moved, when it had stopped, and in several cases which pier it had departed from. The answer to Harlow's question came back in 4 minutes. The Triton was showing 52 fast surface contacts forming up in the anchorage east of Bandar Abbas.
52. Not a drill formation. Not a transit column.
52 boats in 3 distinct clusters, each cluster arranged in a wedge, and all 3 wedges oriented on a southbound heading directly into the strait. Harlow set her coffee down. The boats were a mix of types the IRGC Navy had been accumulating for 2 decades. The backbone was the Bagamar-class fast patrol craft, the same fiberglass speedboats Iran had been using since the tanker war in the 1980s, updated with newer engines but fundamentally the same design philosophy: small, fast, cheap, expendable. Mixed in were several larger Paycap-class missile boats and at least 6 of the newer Zulfiqar-class fast attack craft, which were 16-meter catamaran hulls capable of 65 knots and equipped with Nasser-1 anti-ship cruise missiles. The Nasser-1 was an Iranian development of the Chinese C-704, a sea-skimming missile with a range of about 22 miles, a speed of roughly Mach 0.8, and a 330-pound semi-armor-piercing warhead. Not sophisticated by Western standards. Not precision-guided in the way an American weapon was. But it didn't need to be. A 330-pound warhead moving at 600 miles per hour does not need to be sophisticated. It needs to arrive. And 52 boats carrying 1 or 2 missiles each meant somewhere between 52 and 100 missiles potentially inbound in a single coordinated salvo. Harlow picked up the red phone, 300 miles to the south, aboard the cruiser USS Chancellorsville, CG-62, operating in the Gulf of Oman as the air defense commander for the strike group's southern element. The tactical watch officer received a flash message from 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain that had been originated by the Combined Air Operations Center at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. The message upgraded the threat condition for the Strait transit and authorized a series of pre-planned responses that had been sitting in a binder in every combat direction center in the strike group since the transit planning conference 6 days earlier. The responses were not improvised. They were the product of 2 decades of wargaming this exact scenario, refining it after every exercise, every real-world harassment incident, every intelligence report on IRGC Navy tactics. The Navy had lost the 2002 Millennium Challenge exercise to a swarm attack so badly that it had spent the next 23 years making sure it never lost that way again. The doctrine was called Distributed Maritime Operations, and at its core was a simple principle: never let the swarm become a swarm. Engage it while it's still a formation. Disrupt it before it reaches launch range. And if you can't disrupt it, dilute it so that no single ship absorbs the full salvo. Harlow issued 3 orders in 90 seconds. The first order vectored a pair of F divided by a -18E Super Hornets from the Reagan's Air Wing, already airborne on a routine combat air patrol south of the strait, to reposition north at 25,000 foot over the Omani coast with ordnance hot. Each Super Hornet was carrying 2 AGM-84 Harpoon anti-ship missiles and 4 AGM-65F Maverick infrared-guided air-to-surface missiles, plus a full drum of 570 rounds of 20mm ammunition for the M61A2 Vulcan cannon. The Harpoons were overkill for fast boats. The Mavericks were not. The Maverick's imaging infrared seeker could lock onto a boat engine's thermal signature from 14 miles, and its 300-pound penetrating blast fragmentation warhead would disintegrate a fiberglass hull so completely that recovery crews would find nothing larger than a cooler lid. The second order pushed the John Finn forward, accelerating to 30 knots on a northwest heading to open the engagement geometry and put the destroyer's full weapons suite between the approaching swarm and the carrier. The John Finn carried 96 vertical launch system cells, but for this threat, the relevant weapons were the Mark 45 Mod 4 5-inch gun on the foredeck, the two 25mm Mk38 Mod 2 chain guns amidships, and the Block 1B Phalanx close-in weapon system on the fantail. The 5-inch gun could fire 20 rounds per minute to a range of 13 nautical miles using GPS-guided extended-range munitions that cost about $2,000 each. At that price, the Navy could afford to be generous. The third order was the one that mattered most, and it went not to a ship but to an aircraft already on station. The MQ-9A Reaper drone orbiting at 42,000 foot over the northern strait received a retasking command that shifted its sensor ball from wide-area surveillance to individual target tracking. The Reaper's MTSB electro-optical sensor could identify and classify small surface craft at ranges exceeding 30 miles from its operating altitude. Within 4 minutes of Harlow's order, the Reaper's operator at a ground control station in an air-conditioned trailer somewhere in the Middle East had each of the 52 boats individually designated, numbered, and classified on the targeting network. Every ship in the strike group could now see every boat, its heading, its speed, and its type in real time, on the same screen. The IRGC had planned for American hesitation. They had not planned for American omniscience. At 0618 local time, the 52 boats cleared the anchorage east of Bandar Abbas and entered the strait. They were running in 3 groups. The western group, 18 boats, hugged the Iranian coastline headed south-southeast toward the outbound shipping lane. The central group, 20 boats, pushed straight south through the separation zone. The eastern group, 14 boats, angled southeast toward the inbound lane where the Reagan's formation was steaming. The 3 groups were spread across a front roughly 15 miles wide, and at speeds between 45 and 55 knots, the entire formation would reach potential missile launch range of the carrier in approximately 26 minutes. 26 minutes is both a long time and no time at all. It is long enough to launch aircraft and reposition escorts. It is not long enough to get a tanker out of the way or to call Washington for permission to do something that might end up on the front page. Harlow did not call Washington. She had weapons-free authority from 5th Fleet, which had weapons-free authority from Central Command, which had been granted pre-authorized responses for exactly this scenario by the Secretary of Defense during the transit approval process. The chain of command had already made its decision. It had made it 6 days ago, in a conference room in Bahrain, over PowerPoint slides and legal review. The boats did not know this. The 52 boat commanders, most of them junior officers or senior enlisted equivalent in the IRGC Navy, had been briefed on a plan that depended on closing to 8 nautical miles before the Americans could sort the threat from the background clutter and obtain authorization to engage. Their laminated mission cards showed a timeline. 15 minutes to cross the separation zone, 8 minutes in the engagement zone, 3 minutes inside missile launch range, fire at 8 miles or closer, turn east, run for Omani waters. The total exposure time in the Americans' weapons envelope was supposed to be 11 minutes. The plan assumed 11 minutes of American paralysis. Classification, identification, escalation, authorization, weapons release. 11 minutes of a democracy arguing with itself while fiberglass boats crossed open water. The plan got 45 seconds. At 0619, 1 minute after the boats cleared the anchorage, the John Finn Spy 6 radar had all 52 contacts designated and cross-referenced with the Reaper feed. The combat system had a firing solution on the 18 nearest contacts in the Western Group. The weapons direction officer was waiting for one thing, the commanding officer's verbal order to fire. He got it at 0619 and 45 seconds. Open fire. The Mark 45 barked. The sound of a 5-inch naval gun firing is not what movies suggest. It is a short, brutal crack that hits the chest before the ears process it, followed by the clatter of the automatic loader cycling the next round. The first projectile left the barrel at 2,690 feet per second, an extended-range guided munition that deployed stabilization fins and began adjusting its trajectory via GPS 3 seconds after leaving the muzzle. The target was a Bagamar 11.4 nautical miles northwest, running at 48 knots on a heading of 165 degrees. The round arrived in 26 seconds. The Bagamar was constructed of fiberglass over a plywood frame with a foam core. It had no armor. It had no damage control capability. It had no compartmentalization. The 5-inch guided round detonated 8 feet above the waterline on the starboard quarter. The blast fragmentation pattern shredded the engine, the missile rail, and most of the stern. The boat lost power instantly, nose down, and was swamped by its own wake. The 6 men aboard went into water that was 89 degrees and filled with diesel fuel. The engagement, from trigger pull to kill, cost the United States Navy $2,000. The second round was already in the air before the first one hit. The 5-inch gun cycled at 1 round every 3 seconds. In the first 2 minutes of the engagement, it fired 40 rounds. 34 were guided. Of those 34, 26 struck boats or detonated close enough to inflict mission kills through fragmentation and hull breaching. 9 boats in the Western Group were destroyed or disabled before a single one of them had covered 5 miles from the anchorage. The Western Group broke, not according to doctrine, according to panic. The surviving 9 boats turned hard east, some of them nearly capsizing at 50 knots, and scattered toward the Iranian coast. 3 of them collided with each other in the turn. One collision ruptured a fuel bladder and both boats caught fire. The 7 that made it out of the gun's engagement zone ran north at full speed, abandoning their mission entirely. But the Western Group was the feint. Everyone on both sides knew it was the feint. The real attack was the Central and Eastern Groups, 34 boats, pushing straight at the carrier from the north. And these boats were now 12 minutes from missile range. At 0622, the 2F divided by a -18E Super Hornets reached their station over the Omani coast at 25,000 feet. Their APG-79 active electronically scanned array radars painted the Central Group at 34 miles. 20 contacts, tight formation, heading due south at 52 knots. The lead pilot, call sign Red Hawk, selected 4 targets on the left side of the formation and designated them for Maverick. His wingman, Vandal, took 4 on the right. The Maverick engagement was almost clinical. The AGM-65 FS imaging infrared seeker stared down through 25,000 feet of Gulf haze and saw what it was designed to see: hot engine exhaust against cooler water. The seeker locked. The symbology went steady. Red Hawk pickled 4 Mavericks in 8 seconds, each one separating from the wing pylon with a thump and a smoke trail before its rocket motor ignited and pushed it to just under 700 miles per hour. The 4 missiles covered 14 miles in 72 seconds. 4 Bagamars ceased to exist. The kills were not gentle. A 300-pound warhead impacting a fiberglass boat at 700 miles per hour does not leave a boat. It leaves a debris field the size of a tennis court. The shockwave from each impact was visible on the Reaper's feed as a white flash followed by a rapidly expanding ring of spray. The infrared sensor showed each impact point cooling from white-hot to ambient in under 10 seconds. There was nothing left to burn. Vandal's 4 Mavericks hit 7 seconds later. 8 missiles, 8 boats, 8 kills. 1,600 pounds of Maverick warhead against $2 million worth of Iranian fast attack craft. The Central Group lost 8 of its 20 boats in under 2 minutes without having fired a shot, without having seen the aircraft that killed them, without any warning at all. The 12 surviving boats in the Central Group did something unexpected. They did not scatter. They accelerated. The formation tightened, the boats moving closer together and increasing speed to 55 knots, pushing their engines past the red line. The IRGC Navy had trained for this. The doctrine said that if the outer boats were killed, the inner boats were supposed to compress the formation and sprint for launch range, accepting the losses, trusting that the Americans could not kill all of them before some reached firing position. It was the logic of the swarm reduced to its most brutal arithmetic: enough of us will survive. The arithmetic was wrong, but the courage was real. At 0626, the Eastern Group, 14 boats, cleared the radar shadow of a cluster of anchored tankers near Lyric Island and appeared on the Spy 6 as 14 new contacts bearing 020 degrees from the Reagan at a range of 18 nautical miles. These boats had taken a longer route, hugging the island chain, and they were now closer to the carrier than the Central Group. 18 nautical miles. At 52 knots, that was approximately 20 minutes to missile range if they maintained their current course. But the Nasser 1 missile carried by the Zulfiqar-class boats in this group had a stated range of 22 miles. 4 of these 14 boats were already inside launch range. This was the real play, not the Western feint, not the central charge. The Eastern Group, arriving from an unexpected bearing, masked by commercial traffic and island geography, carrying the longer-range missiles. The IRGC had studied American carrier defense doctrine carefully enough to know that the escorts would push toward the most obvious threat. The John Finn was now 8 nautical miles northwest of the Reagan, fully engaged with the Western and Central Groups, its 5-inch gun cycling continuously. The carrier's defensive screen on the northeast axis was thinner.
Harlow saw it.
She saw it because the Reaper saw it, and the Reaper's picture was on her screen in the Flag Combat Direction Center, and she had been doing this for 27 years. She saw 14 contacts appear on a bearing that was not the primary threat axis, and she understood in about 2 seconds what the IRGC was trying to do. She ordered the Reagan to come hard to starboard, turning the carrier's stern toward the Eastern Group to open the range. A Nimitz-class carrier at 30 knots turns like a building falling over sideways, but it turns, and every second of heading change added distance. She ordered the destroyer USS Halsey, DDG-97, which had been screening the carrier's starboard quarter, to sprint northeast at flank speed to intercept the Eastern Group. And she ordered the 2 Super Hornets to break off the Central Group and reposition to the northeast. The Halsey was a Flight IIA Arleigh Burke, older than the John Finn but carrying the same 5-inch gun and the same close-in weapon systems. Its commanding officer, Captain David Moreno, understood the geometry the moment the order came through. 14 boats, 4 of them already in missile range, and his ship was the only thing between them and a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier with 5,000 sailors aboard. Moreno rang up flank speed. The Halsey's 4 LM-2500 gas turbines spooled to maximum output, pushing 100,000 shaft horsepower through the reduction gears, and the destroyer leapt forward to 31 knots with a bone-white bow wave that rose to the bridge windows. At that speed, on that heading, he would close the Eastern Group in 9 minutes. He did not have 9 minutes. The 4 Zulfiqar boats with Nasser 1 missiles were already inside launch range and could fire at any moment. At 0628, the first Nasser 1 launched. The missile came off the rail of a Zulfiqar boat designated Track 4207 on the Halsey's combat system. The Nasser 1 dropped from the rail, its solid rocket booster ignited, and it accelerated to Mach 0.8 in 4 seconds, transitioning to sea-skim altitude of approximately 15 feet above the water. Its radar altimeter held it steady. Its terminal active radar seeker was set to activate at 3 miles from the programmed target location. The missile weighed 770 pounds and was heading south-southwest at 614 miles per hour toward the USS Ronald Reagan. 7 seconds later, a second Nasser, 1 launched from a different Zulfiqar.
Then a third, then a fourth.
4 anti-ship cruise missiles, sea-skimming, inbound on the carrier from the northeast. Aboard the Reagan, the Spy 6 radar on the John Finn detected the missile launches within 2 seconds of booster ignition. The thermal bloom of a rocket motor is unmistakable on a phased array radar, and the system automatically classified the contacts as ASCMs, anti-ship cruise missiles, and generated engagement quality tracks. The data flowed through the Cooperative Engagement Capability Network to every Aegis-equipped ship in the strike group simultaneously. The Halsey's Aegis system had the tracks before the missiles had covered their first mile. The Halsey responded with a weapon designed for exactly this moment. 2 RIM-162 evolved Sea Sparrow missiles erupted from the forward VLS cells in a cloud of white exhaust, accelerating vertically before tipping over and screaming toward the inbound Nasser ones at Mach 4. The USSM cost about $2.5 million per round. It used X-band semi-active radar homing in its earlier variants and active radar homing in the Block II, which was what the Halsey carried. The Block II USSM could engage sea-skimming targets at ranges up to 30 nautical miles and had demonstrated a kill probability against subsonic cruise missiles that the Navy described as very high in unclassified briefings and that was rumored to be above 95% in classified ones. The first USSM intercepted the lead Nasser, one at a range of 6.4 nautical miles from the Reagan. The engagement happened at a closing speed of roughly Mach 4.8 combined. The 86-pound blast fragmentation warhead on the USSM detonated within lethal radius. The Nasser 1 disintegrated. The debris fell into the strait from an altitude of 12 feet, which meant it simply became part of the water. The second USSM killed the second Nasser 1 4 seconds later. Range 5.8 miles from the carrier.
Clean kill. Debris in the water.
The third Nasser 1 was killed by the Reagan's own close-in defense. The ship's self-defense system aboard the carrier detected the inbound missile, classified it, and automatically engaged it with a RIM-116 rolling airframe missile fired from one of the two Mk-49 launchers mounted on the carrier sponsons. The RAM is a small, fast, infrared homing missile that costs about $1 million and was specifically designed to kill the missile that gets past everything else. It killed the third Nasser 1 at a range of 1.9 nautical miles. Close enough that several sailors on the carrier's weather decks saw the flash. The fourth Nasser 1 was killed by the Phalanx CWS on the Reagan's starboard quarter. The Block 1B Phalanx tracked the incoming missile with its Ku-band search and track radar, calculated a firing solution in 0.3 seconds, and opened fire with its 20mm M61A1 Gatling gun at a range of 1,600 yards. The gun fired 270 rounds in 3.6 seconds. 11 of them struck the missile. At 3,650 feet per second, each tungsten penetrator carried enough kinetic energy to punch through an engine block. They punched through the Nasser 1's airframe, its fuel section, and its warhead casing. The missile tumbled, broke apart, and impacted the water 890 yards from the carrier's hull.
Close. Too close.
Close enough that the spray from the impact was visible from the flight deck. Close enough that the after-action report would later describe the engagement as inside minimum acceptable engagement range.
4 missiles fired. 4 missiles killed.
0 hits on the carrier. But the margin had been measured in hundreds of yards and single-digit seconds, and every officer in the Combat Direction Center knew that if there had been 10 missiles instead of 4, the math might have been different. The Zulfiqar boats that had fired were now empty. Their one contribution to the fight had been launched, intercepted, and destroyed. They had nothing left. The RGC doctrine at this point called for them to turn east and run for Omani territorial waters. 3 of the 4 did exactly that, peeling off at maximum speed. The 4th did something no one anticipated. It turned toward the Halsey and accelerated. Track 4207, the first boat that had launched, was now heading directly at the destroyer at 62 knots. The Zulfiqar class was faster than the Bagamar, and this one had shed the weight of its missile and most of its fuel. It was running lighter and faster than anything in the IRGC inventory was rated for. The range was 4 nautical miles and closing. Moreno did not hesitate. He didn't have time to wonder whether this was a suicide run or a navigation error or a mechanical failure that had locked the helm. 4 miles at 62 knots was 3 minutes and 40 seconds. He ordered the Mk-38 25mm chain gun to engage. The Mk-38 Mod 2 is a stabilized remotely operated weapon that fires 25mm high-explosive incendiary rounds at a rate of 180 per minute, accurate to 2,500 meters against surface targets. The gun costs about $500,000. Each round costs about $25. The chain gun opened fire at 2,200 meters. The first burst of 15 rounds walked across the water and into the Zulfiqar's bow. Fiberglass shattered. The second burst hit the wheelhouse. The boat veered to port, then corrected, then veered again. The third burst struck the engine compartment. Black smoke erupted from the stern. The boat decelerated from 62 knots to 30 knots, then to 15, then to nothing. It wallowed beam to in a cloud of its own diesel smoke 1,100 meters from the Halsey's hull. Total ammunition expended, 45 rounds. Total cost, $1,125. The engagement lasted 22 seconds. Meanwhile, the Central Group was dying. 12 boats had compressed their formation and sprinted south, trusting the doctrine, trusting the numbers, trusting that enough of them would survive. The 2 Super Hornets had repositioned overhead after dealing with the Eastern Group's missile launches. Red Hawk and Vandal were now out of Mavericks but still carrying full guns. They descended to 3,000 feet and began strafing runs. The M61A2 Vulcan on a Super Hornet fires 6,000 rounds per minute of 20mm PGU-28/B semi-armor-piercing high-explosive incendiary rounds. Each round weighs about half a pound. At 6,000 rounds per minute, the gun empties its 570-round drum in 5.7 seconds. A 1-second burst puts 100 rounds into an area the size of a car at a range of 2,000 feet against a fiberglass boat. A 1-second burst is excessive. A half-second burst is excessive. But at 480 knots and 3,000 feet, the geometry of a strafing run does not allow for surgical precision. The pilots took what the physics gave them. Red Hawk's first pass destroyed 2 Bagamars and damaged a third. The damaged boat lost power and began circling to port with its helm jammed. Vandal's first pass killed 1 boat and set another on fire. The burning boat's crew went over the side. They were in the water for 40 minutes before an Omani Coast Guard cutter picked them up. The 5-inch gun on the John Finn was still firing. It had been firing for 12 minutes. It had expended 147 rounds. The barrel was approaching its recommended sustained fire limit, and the gun captain was monitoring barrel temperature with the focus of a man who understood that a cracked gun tube meant losing the ship's primary surface weapon in the middle of a fight. He slowed the rate of fire to 12 rounds per minute. At that rate, the barrel would hold. The central group was down to 5 boats.
Then 3, then 1.
The last Bagamar in the central group, track 4188, was still running south at 50 knots. It had not fired its C-704 missile. It was 11 nautical miles from the Reagan and closing.
The swarm was gone. The formation was gone. The doctrine was gone.
But this one boat was still coming, driven by either extraordinary courage or total ignorance of what had happened to every other vessel around it. The John Finn's 5-inch gun put a guided round through its engine block at 0641. The boat stopped as if it had hit a wall. The C-704 on its stern rail toppled sideways and fell into the water. The crew of 4 abandoned the sinking hull and were later recovered by a U.S. Navy rigid-hulled inflatable boat launched from the Halsey. At 0644, 26 minutes after the first boat had cleared the anchorage at Bandar Abbas, the engagement was over. The Reaper drone overhead confirmed no further fast surface contacts outbound from the Iranian coast. The Triton at 50,000 feet confirmed no additional formations marshalling at Bandar Abbas or any other IRGC Navy installation. The SBY-6 on the John Finn showed a surface picture returning to the ordinary chaos of commercial traffic. The Strait of Hormuz was resuming its default state, crowded, dangerous, and indifferent. The numbers told the story in the language the Strait understood best, which was money. 52 IRGC Navy fast attack craft had sortied. 31 were confirmed destroyed. 7 were disabled and adrift, later recovered by Iranian tugs. 7 had fled back to the coast in the first 3 minutes after the Western group broke. 3 had escaped into Omani territorial waters and were later interned. 4 were unaccounted for, presumed sunk in deep water with no survivors. For Nasser, 1 anti-ship cruise missiles had been fired at a United States aircraft carrier. All 4 had been intercepted. The closest had been killed at 890 yards. No American ship was hit. No American sailor was wounded. The Delos Prosperity, the Panamanian tanker whose engine room fire had started this story, extinguished its fire at 0635, requested a tug, and continued its transit to Fujairah 2 days later. Its crew never knew what had happened 3 miles off their bow. Total IRGC Navy assets destroyed or disabled, 38 boats, estimated replacement value $14.2 million, plus 31 missiles that never launched, estimated value $3.7 million. Total Iranian personnel lost. The Navy did not release figures. Estimates from commercial satellite imagery of recovery operations over the following week suggested between 80 and 160 fatalities. Total U.S. ordnance expended: 168 5-inch guided rounds, 16 Maverick missiles, 2 Evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, 1 rolling airframe missile, approximately 580 rounds of 20mm phalanx ammunition, approximately 45 rounds of 25mm chain gun ammunition, and roughly 2,800 rounds of 20mm Vulcan cannon ammunition from the 2 Super Hornets. Total ordnance cost: approximately $6.8 million. The United States Navy had spent $6.8 million to destroy $17.9 million worth of Iranian naval assets, to intercept 4 anti-ship missiles that could have killed 5,000 sailors, and to keep open the waterway through which 21% of the world's daily oil consumption flows. The Millennium Challenge problem, the one the Navy had lost in 2002 and spent 2 decades solving, had been answered. Not with a new weapon or a secret technology, but with something simpler: information. The swarm's entire theory of victory depended on surprise, on confusion, on the Americans not knowing what was coming until it was too late. The MQ-4C Triton at 50,000 feet, the MQ-9 Reaper at 42,000 feet, the Spy-6 radar, the Cooperative Engagement Capability Network, the Pre-Authorized Weapons-Free Authority. None of these were secret. All of them were publicly known capabilities that the IRGC could have accounted for. The IRGC had built a plan for the Navy of 2002. They had executed it against the Navy of 2025. The gap between those two forces was not measured in ships or missiles. It was measured in seconds. Seconds of awareness. Seconds of decision. Seconds of authorization. The swarm needed 11 minutes of American hesitation. It got 45 seconds. And 45 seconds was not enough time to cross 20 miles of open water against a force that could see every boat, track every heading, and shoot every target from the moment it left the harbor. The Strait of Hormuz went back to being the Strait of Hormuz. The tankers transited.
The oil flowed.
The Reagan passed through the eastern exit and turned south toward the Gulf of Oman. The John Finn's gun crew swabbed the barrel and counted their remaining ammunition. The Halsey recovered 4 Iranian sailors from the water and gave them blankets and medical treatment and Gatorade because that is what the Navy does after it is done killing you. And somewhere in a ground control station in the Middle East, a Reaper pilot who had been on shift for 14 hours watched the last IRGC boat limp back into Bandar Abbas on one engine, trailing smoke, and entered the final target assessment into the log. He saved the file, stood up, and went to get a sandwich. The carrier was never on fire. The plan to set it on fire had lasted 26 minutes. It had cost Iran a generation of fast attack craft and somewhere between 80 and 160 men who had been told the Americans would hesitate. They did not hesitate. The operator almost ignored it. At 0437 local time, in a compartment that smelled like sweat and old coffee, a sonar technician aboard USS Halsey sat up in his chair, pulled one headphone cup tighter against his ear, and stared at a line on his waterfall display that looked like every other line. A faint smear of green against the cascade of noise that the Strait of Hormuz produces every second of every day.
Shrimp snapping.
Hull cavitation from tankers. The groan of current dragging across a sunken barge somewhere southeast.
The strait is not quiet.
The strait is never quiet. It is one of the loudest, most acoustically cluttered corridors of shallow water on the planet, and every American sonar operator who has ever worked a Hormuz transit knows the same thing. You will hear 1,000 sounds that mean nothing, and the one that means something will sound exactly the same. He almost marked it by a logic and moved on.
He didn't.
Somewhere beneath 80 feet of warm, silty water, on a shelf of compacted sand and broken coral where the bottom of the strait rises toward the Iranian coast, 3 submarines sat with their engines off. Each one 29 meters long. Each one displacing 120 tons submerged. Each one built for approximately $15 million.
Gota class.
Diesel electric.
Iranian.
Derived from North Korean designs that were themselves derived from Yugoslav coastal defense boats from the 1970s.
They are small. They are cheap.
They are not sophisticated. And in the right water, at the right depth, doing absolutely nothing, they are functionally invisible to every major anti-submarine warfare system the United States Navy has spent the last 4 decades perfecting. Because those systems were not built for this. The American anti-submarine playbook is a masterpiece of deep water detection. Towed arrays that can hear a Russian Akula at 40 nautical miles. Hull-mounted sonars that can track a Chinese Jean-class ballistic missile submarine through convergence zones across hundreds of miles of Pacific Ocean. Sonobuoy patterns that can sanitize a box of open water the size of Connecticut in under an hour. In blue water, the United States Navy finds submarines the way a hawk finds mice. Patiently, precisely, and from a distance that makes the kill inevitable before the prey knows it has been seen. The Strait of Hormuz is not blue water. The Strait of Hormuz is a bathtub. The deepest point in the shipping lanes barely reaches 260 feet. The average depth in the traffic separation scheme is closer to 150. The water temperature in summer creates thermal layers so dense that active sonar pulses refract, scatter, bounce off the bottom, bounce off the surface, and return to the transducer as a wall of meaningless noise. The seabed is uneven, cluttered with pipelines, old anchors, debris from decades of tanker traffic, and geological formations that return sonar pings with signatures almost identical to submarine hulls. American sonar operators working the strait have a name for the experience. They call it being deaf in a nightclub. Everything is loud. Nothing is useful. And into this environment, the Islamic Republic of Iran Navy had placed 3 boats with a plan that was not stupid. The plan was, in fact, the kind of elegant asymmetric thinking that keeps war planners in the Pentagon awake in the small hours, staring at ceilings and running cost ratios in their heads. The concept was simple. Do nothing. Let the carrier come to you. This is a speculative scenario. The date is fabricated. The operation is fictional. Every weapon, every system, every cost figure, and every tactical specification in this story is real. The 3 Godders had been towed into position 4 days earlier by civilian fishing boats, a method Iran had practiced in exercises observed by satellite but never fully understood in context. They motored the last 6 nautical miles on battery power, settled onto the bottom in a staggered line running roughly northeast to southwest, 4 nautical miles apart, and shut everything down.
No engines. No active sonar. No communications.
Crew of 18 per boat, breathing air from rechargeable canisters, eating cold rations, urinating into bottles. Waiting. The only sound each submarine produced was a 47 Hz tonal, a faint low-frequency hum generated by the battery monitoring system, a component that could not be turned off without risking a thermal runaway in the lithium cells.
47 Hz.
Buried 30 decibels below the ambient noise floor. Invisible to hull-mounted sonar. Invisible to helicopter dipping sonar. Invisible to every active sensor in the American inventory for this environment. But not invisible to everything. The staggered line was oriented to bracket the narrowest segment of the eastbound shipping lane, a stretch where the navigable channel for a ship drawing 37 feet of water contracts to less than 6 nautical miles across. A Nimitz-class nuclear aircraft carrier draws 37 feet. It cannot deviate from the deep water track without risking grounding. It transits the strait on a predictable course, at a predictable speed, through a channel whose dimensions have not changed since the last ice age. The carrier has to come through. It has to come through here. And when it does, it will pass between the first and third Godders at a range where even 1970s-era straight-running torpedoes have a meaningful probability of impact. The man coordinating the ambush sat in the second submarine, the middle boat in the line, Lieutenant Commander Davoud. His background, according to Iranian state media profiles that Western intelligence had assembled into a dossier over 7 years, included 2 years at the Bandar Abbas Submarine Warfare School, a 6-month technical exchange in Pyongyang, and command of a Goddard during Exercise Great Prophet 9, where he had simulated a torpedo attack on a target barge being towed at 10 knots and missed by 600 yards. He had not missed in the 40 rehearsals conducted since then in a reservoir outside Bandar Abbas where the depth and temperature profile had been artificially matched to the strait's summer conditions. Davoud carried the cell's only encrypted burst transmitter, a system that compressed a 3-second message into a 0.4-second transmission.
A blip.
A flicker of electromagnetic energy so brief that direction-finding equipment needed a minimum of 1.2 seconds of continuous signal to generate a bearing fix. The burst would be over before the American electronic warfare systems could triangulate. That was the theory. 12 nautical miles to the south-southwest, the USS Abraham Lincoln, CVN-72, was making her transit. The Lincoln is a Nimitz-class carrier. She displaces approximately 100,000 tons at full load. Her flight deck is 1,092 feet long. Her crew numbers over 5,000. Her air wing, Carrier Air Wing 7, represents roughly $4.5 billion in aircraft alone. The ship herself cost approximately $13 billion in current replacement value. She was making 12 knots eastbound, surrounded by her escort screen, heading for a deployment in the 5th Fleet area of operations that had been scheduled 9 months earlier and accelerated 3 weeks ago when Iran began moving fast attack craft into formations near Abu Musa Island and publicly threatened to close the strait to military traffic. The strike group formation was textbook. The guided missile cruiser USS Mobile Bay, a Ticonderoga class, rode 2 nautical miles ahead and to starboard. She carried 122 vertical launch cells loaded with a mix of SM-2 Block IB surface-to-air missiles at $2.1 million each, Tomahawk cruise missiles at $1.87 million each, and VL-ASROC anti-submarine rockets at $1.6 million each. Her hull-mounted and SQS-53C sonar was pinging on a 30-second cycle, its active pulses radiating outward through water that returned so much clutter the sonar supervisor had already downgraded confidence on 4 separate contacts in the past hour, all of which turned out to be bottom features. The destroyer USS Sterett held the port quarter at 3 nautical miles. An Arleigh Burke-class flight IIA, $1.8 billion, 96 vertical launch cells, and SQS-53C hull sonar, and the Noor and SQR-20 multifunction towed array, which the Navy quietly considered the most capable passive submarine detection system deployed on any surface combatant in the fleet. The SQR-20 was specifically optimized for low-frequency detection in cluttered littoral environments. It was designed, almost literally, to find exactly the kind of sound a Goddard battery monitoring system makes. The SQR-20 was not in the water. 2 hours earlier, Sterett's sonar team had requested permission to reel in the towed array. The cable was picking up so much flow noise from the shallow bottom currents, so many false tonals from the commercial traffic, so much interference from the thermal inversions that the operators were spending more time dismissing phantom contacts than looking for real ones. Lieutenant Commander Okafor, running Sterett's anti-submarine warfare module, approved the request. This was standard operating procedure for Hormuz transit. Every berk that had transited in the last 18 months had done the same thing. The towed array in the strait was considered a liability, not an asset. Nobody had tested that assumption against a submarine sitting motionless on the bottom. A second destroyer, USS Halsey, trailed 5 nautical miles astern, running the group's other towed array, an older and SQR-19. Halsey's array was still deployed, but the SQR-19 lacked the low-frequency optimization of the SQR-20. It could hear the 47 Hz tonal if conditions were perfect. Conditions in the Strait of Hormuz are never perfect. Above the formation, two SH-60 Seahawk helicopters from the Lincoln's Air Wing were running a dipping sonar pattern. Seahawk 612 and Seahawk 614, each carrying an AQS-22 airborne low-frequency sonar, had been cycling through predetermined hover points for 90 minutes. Lower the transducer on its cable.
Ping. Listen. Reel up. Fly to the next point.
The pattern was designed to sanitize a corridor ahead of the strike group's advance, focusing on the approach vectors that intelligence assessed as the most likely submarine threat axes. The assessed threat axes pointed south. Iranian submarine activity and exercises had consistently originated from the southern approaches, from the vicinity of Keshem Island and the deep channel south of Larak. The dipping sonar pattern was weighted accordingly. The hover points were concentrated south and southwest of the formations track. The gutters were northeast. Already inside the screen. Already ahead of the formation. Already waiting. The helicopters were looking in the right ocean. They were searching the wrong water. At 0441, Commander Reyes stood in Mobile Bay's Combat Information Center, watching the radar picture with the particular tension that every surface warfare officer feels during a Hormuz transit. The Spy 1B displays showed 47 surface contacts within 30 nautical miles, most of them tankers, container ships, dhows, and fishing boats that the strait produces in unending streams day and night. The air picture was cleaner. Two Iranian P-3F Orion maritime patrol aircraft orbiting well inside Iranian airspace, watching the carrier group with the same intensity the carrier group was watching the strait. Everyone was watching everyone. That was normal. What was not normal was the message that had come down from 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain 6 hours ago. Intelligence suggested Iran might attempt a demonstration. The word demonstration was doing a lot of work in that sentence, because it could mean anything from a fast attack craft swarm feinting toward the formation to something considerably more serious. Reyes had spent 20 minutes studying the message and concluded it told him nothing he didn't already know, which was that transiting Hormuz was inherently dangerous and that Iran had the tools to make it more so. He was right about that. At 0448, the passive sonar operator in Dawood's submarine touched the commander's arm. Bearing rate shift. The Lincoln had passed the first Gotter's position. The carrier was entering the kill zone. At 12 knots, roughly 1,200 feet per minute, she would be centered between the first and second submarines in approximately 6 minutes. Dawood opened the torpedo tube outer door interlocks. Pneumatic. Nearly silent. Nearly. The tubes flooded with seawater. 2 torpedoes per boat. In the other 2 submarines, captains who had received the prepositioned timing protocol performed the same sequence simultaneously. 6 torpedo tubes opened across 8 nautical miles of seafloor. The sound of the outer doors was a transient, a brief metallic groan that propagated outward through the water at 5,000 feet per second. 9 nautical miles to the south-southwest, aboard USS Halsey, sonar technician second class Rivera heard something. Bearing 027. A transient, metal on metal, faint, brief, gone. In the open ocean, this would trigger an immediate classification effort. In the Strait of Hormuz, you hear transients on every bearing, every few minutes, all watch long. Wrecks settling, anchors dragging, hulls popping in temperature gradients, shrimp colonies snapping in coordinated bursts that can sound remarkably like mechanical events. Rivera logged it. One line. Transient bearing 027, 0449. Possible mechanical, possible biologic. No classification. He did not call it up to the tactical action officer. He almost let it go. Then Dawood made the transmission. At 0453, Dawood picked up the handset for the burst transmitter and sent the execution code. A single compressed word. The signal lasted 0.4 seconds on a frequency that the American Electronic Warfare Library had catalogued and flagged as a known Iranian naval burst communications band. Rivera didn't hear the burst. His equipment wasn't configured for electronic intercept, but Halsey's and /SLQ-32 electronic warfare suite was. The system caught the 0.4 second emission, matched it against its threat library, and flagged it automatically. The display in Halsey's electronic warfare module lit red. Iranian burst communications. Bearing 029. Rivera saw the EW alert come across the tactical display at almost the same moment he remembered the transient from 4 minutes ago. Bearing 027 then. Bearing 029 now. Close enough to be the same contact. He keyed the intercom before the EW operator finished his own report. The 2 data points converged on the tactical action officer's screen simultaneously. Lieutenant Commander Cho, Halsey's TAO, processed the information in approximately 4 seconds. A transient that sounded mechanical, followed by a burst communication on a known Iranian military frequency.
same bearing. Submarines transmit when they are coordinating. Submarines coordinate when they are about to act. Cho patched to the Strike Group Anti-Submarine Warfare Commander aboard Lincoln. The report went up the chain with the speed that only genuine alarm produces. At 0454, Rear Admiral Price, the Strike Group Commander, issued a single command across the ASW net. Prosecute Sierra 47. All units. And now the math that Iran had so carefully constructed began to invert. Seahawk 612, 3 nautical miles west of the Ghata's position, banked hard to the east. Lieutenant Junior Grade Pham pushed the helicopter's nose down and accelerated. Petty Officer First Class Gutierrez, her sensor operator, was already reeling the AQS-22 dipping sonar cable back onto its drum. The helicopter crossed the distance in under 4 minutes, arrived on bearing 029 referenced from Halsey's fix, and Gutierrez lowered the transducer back into the water. He went active. A 1,500-watt pulse blasted outward. In 80 feet of water, at this range, the physics are brutal and simple. The sound hits the target and comes back almost instantly. Solid return. Metal object on the bottom. Not a wreck. The signature was too clean, too symmetrical. 29 meters long. Gutierrez called it submarine, diesel. On the bottom, bearing 031, range 3,200 yards. That was Davoud's boat, the one that had just transmitted. Simultaneously, the active pulse illuminated enough of the surrounding seabed that a second return appeared on the display. Fainter, farther, 4 nautical miles to the southwest. Same profile, same size. 2 submarines. Aboard Sterret, Okafor heard the helicopter's report and gave the order that would prove decisive. Deploy the towed array. Now. The SQR-20 began paying out cable. 4 minutes to operating depth. At 0458, the array reached depth and began listening. Within 90 seconds, the sonar operators had the 47 Hz tonal. Bearing 018. Range estimated 11 nautical miles. Northeast of the other 2 contacts. A third submarine. Exactly where a third boat in a staggered ambush line would be positioned. 3 contacts. 3 positions. The geometry of the ambush was now visible, and the Americans could see what it had been designed to do. A bracket shot across the narrowest point of the deep channel, converging on the predicted position of the carrier at the predicted time. The carrier was no longer at the predicted position. At 0455, Price had ordered an emergency turn. The Lincoln's 4 bronze screws churned the shallow water as 100,000 tons of warship began a ponderous swing to starboard, away from the threat bearing. A Nimitz-class carrier at 12 knots needs approximately 3,200 feet to reverse course. Half a nautical mile of ocean consumed by the simple physics of mass and momentum. She could not stop. She could only bend her track and hope the geometry changed enough to matter. She was also dumping speed, slowing from 12 knots toward 5, reducing her wake signature. The Iranian torpedoes were wake homers, Chinese-derived U-4 variants. Straight runners that relied on detecting the turbulence pattern of a ship's passage and turning into it. Less speed meant less wake meant less for the seekers to find. The Lincoln's SLQ-25 Nixie torpedo countermeasures were already deployed. 2 towed acoustic decoys, 1 off each quarter, each a device that mimicked the acoustic and hydrodynamic signature of the ship's wake. Each Nixie cost approximately $50,000. Against a wake-homing torpedo on a straight approach, the Nixie presented a false target that the torpedo's primitive seeker head could not distinguish from the real thing. $13 billion of aircraft carrier, defended by $100,000 of towed noisemaker. The ratio was absurd. The engineering was sound. At 0458, Davoud ordered tubes fired. Compressed air ejected the first torpedo, then the second. 2 weapons in the water from the command boat, running at 40 knots on preset bearings toward where the carrier should have been. 4 nautical miles southwest, the first Ghata fired 2. 8 nautical miles northeast, the third Ghata fired 2. 6 torpedoes. Total munitions cost approximately $3.6 million. Aimed at a formation whose combined replacement value exceeded $22 billion. Each torpedo carried approximately 400 pounds of TNT-equivalent explosive. Against the hull of a Nimitz-class carrier, that warhead could not achieve a kill. The carrier's underwater protection system, a layered arrangement of voids, liquid loading and structural bulkheads, was designed to absorb precisely this kind of threat. But a 400-pound detonation against the hull below the waterline could buckle frames, breach compartments, damage shaft seals, and compromise propulsion. A single torpedo hit would not sink the Lincoln. A single torpedo hit would force the most expensive warship on Earth into a drydock for months, remove a carrier from the global deployment rotation, and produce an image that would dominate every news cycle on the planet for weeks. Iran did not need to sink the carrier. Iran needed to touch it. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Mobile Bay fired 2 VL Asrock anti-submarine rockets from her vertical launch cells.
Each round, $1.6 million, arced upward on its rocket motor, flew to the designated coordinates, and released a Mark 54 lightweight torpedo by parachute. The Mark 54 is 12.75 inches in diameter. It weighs 608 pounds. It runs at 40 knots. It carries a 96-pound warhead. It costs approximately $400,000. Against a submarine with a thin single-hull construction displacing 120 tons, 96 pounds is catastrophic. The first ASROC targeted Davud. The second targeted the southern Ghawtar. Seahawk 612 dropped a Mark 54 directly. Gutierrez had a precise fix on Davud's boat. The torpedo hit the water, activated its seeker, and began a helical search pattern centered on the Ghawtar's last known position. Davud now had two problems that were going to converge into one. His torpedoes were running. His mission, in a technical sense, was complete, but a Mark 54 was in the water above him in 80 feet of depth. There was nowhere to hide. A Ghawtar-class submarine has a maximum submerged speed of approximately 11 knots. The Mark 54 runs at 40. The submarine could not outrun it. It could not outdive it. The water was too shallow to exploit thermal layers, and the Ghawtar carried no torpedo countermeasures. No decoys, no noisemakers, no expendable jammers. The submarine had been designed for one mission profile: get into position undetected, fire, and run for the coast before anyone figured out what happened. The entire concept depended on not being found before the torpedoes were away. Nobody had adequately planned for what happened after being found. Davud ordered maximum speed southeast. The electric motor wound up. The Ghawtar lurched off the bottom, trailing a cloud of silt, accelerating to 11 knots through water that now contained an active torpedo specifically designed to kill exactly what he was. At 0501, the Mark 54 dropped by Seahawk 612 acquired Davud's submarine at a range of 600 yards. Terminal homing. The torpedo closed the gap in under 30 seconds. Impact was against the pressure hull just after the sail. At 80 feet of depth, the detonation ruptured the hull along a fracture line 3 meters long. Seawater entered the engine compartment at a rate that exceeded any damage control capability a crew of 18 could have mounted even in theory. The submarine's depth gauge swept past 100 feet as the boat, suddenly heavier by tons, descended to the bottom 120 feet below. The descent took 11 seconds. A $400,000 torpedo had just killed a $15 million submarine that was trying to kill a $13 billion aircraft carrier. 4 nautical miles to the southwest, the first Ghawtar's captain heard the explosion through his hull. He also heard the ASROC torpedo enter the water above him. He did not know the details of what had just happened to the command boat. He knew it was loud and it was close, and the sound that followed it was the unmistakable high-frequency ping of an active torpedo seeker sweeping toward him. His own torpedoes were already running. There was nothing more he could do for them. He ordered immediate ascent and maximum speed. Southeast. The Iranian coast lay 38 nautical miles away. At 11 knots, roughly 3.5 hours. He needed 3.5 hours. He had approximately 90 seconds. The Mark 54 from Mobile Bay's ASROC acquired him at 800 yards. Same result. The warhead opened the hull. The sea came in. The submarine settled to the bottom of the strait in a spreading cloud of silt and debris and rising bubbles that would mark the grave site for the salvage divers who would come later. 2 submarines destroyed in 4 minutes. Cost of the 2 Mark 54 torpedoes, $800,000. Cost of the ASROC delivery vehicles, $3.2 million. Total American expenditure to neutralize both boats, $4 million. The submarines they killed had cost a combined $30 million to build. 8 nautical miles to the northeast, the third Ghawtar was running. The third captain had heard both explosions. He had transmitted once after firing, a brief burst to confirm torpedoes away. That transmission was intercepted by Halsey's electronic warfare suite. Bearing 041. Sterrett's freshly deployed towed array confirmed with a 47 Hz tonal, now Doppler shifted by the submarine's movement, giving both bearing and speed. Seahawk 614 was already repositioning. The pilot covered 6 nautical miles in 8 minutes and dropped a pattern of /SSQ 62 die-cast sonobuoys, directional active sonobuoys that cost approximately $2,200 each, across the submarine's predicted escape route. The third Ghawtar was now being tracked simultaneously by passive sonobuoy, towed array, and active dipping sonar. It was the most precisely located object in the Strait of Hormuz. Sterrett fired a VL ASROC. The rocket arced north. The Mark 54 payload descended by parachute, entered the water, activated its seeker. Acquisition at 900 yards. The third captain attempted a crash dive, which in 80 feet of water meant driving the submarine toward the bottom at maximum downward angle. The maneuver gained him nothing. The Mark 54 caught the submarine at 70 feet. Detonation. Hull failure. The third Ghawtar joined the other 2 on the floor of the strait. 3 submarines. 9 minutes. Over. But the torpedoes were not over. 12 nautical miles to the south, 6 Iranian torpedoes were still running through the water at 40 knots. They had no wire guidance. Once fired, they could not be redirected or recalled. They were ballistic in the truest sense, committed to their preset courses, their simple wake-homing seekers scanning for turbulence. 4 of the 6 had been aimed at the carrier's predicted position at 0458. The Lincoln's emergency turn and speed reduction had shifted her nearly a mile from that position. 3 of the 4 torpedoes ran through empty water, their seekers finding nothing, their fuel burning down to nothing, their casings eventually sinking to the bottom as inert metal cylinders that would be recovered by Navy EOD divers over the following week.
The 4th torpedo found a wake, not the Lincoln's. The Nixie decoys.
The towed device was doing exactly what it was built to do, generating a false wake signature that a simple seeker head could not distinguish from the real thing. The torpedo turned into the false wake, closed to 50 feet, and detonated. The Nixie was obliterated. $50,000 of decoy absorbed $600,000 of torpedo. The Lincoln felt the detonation as a dull thump transmitted through the water and up through the hull.
No damage, no casualties. The ship continued her turn.
The 2 torpedoes from the 3rd Ghautar, fired from 8 nautical miles to the northeast, had been aimed at the predicted positions of the carrier's escorts. One ran out of fuel 1,100 yards from USS Halsey, never having acquired a target. Its seeker had pinged uselessly against the confused acoustic environment of the strait until the battery died.
The 6th torpedo found something. Not a warship, not a decoy.
A 280,000 deadweight ton Panamanian flagged crude oil tanker, the MV Pacific Harmony, making 8 knots through the outbound shipping lane. The torpedo's wake-homing seeker, designed to chase the turbulence of a moving ship, locked onto the tanker's massive wake. The weapon closed from astern. It detonated 20 feet from the tanker's stern, directly beneath the waterline. The blast buckled 3 hull plates below the waterline. The engine room flooded. The tanker developed an 11-degree list and went dead in the water within 6 minutes. Her crew of 32 evacuated to the bow sections. No fatalities. But the inner hull had sustained a 4-foot gash, and 280,000 tons of Basra light crude oil to the Strait of Hormuz at a rate that would accelerate as the structural damage worsened over the following hours. At 0512, Admiral Price stood in flag plot aboard the Lincoln, receiving reports. His carrier was untouched. His escorts were untouched. His helicopters had killed 3 submarines in 9 minutes using weapons whose combined cost was less than the price of a single Ghautar. By every tactical metric, this was a decisive American victory. The kind of engagement that gets studied at the Naval War College for decades. The kind of kill ratio that makes careers. 3 hours later, CNN opened its broadcast with aerial footage of a black slick spreading across turquoise water. The anchor said the word carrier once in a 12-minute segment. She said the word tanker 14 times. By sunset, the Strait of Hormuz was closed to commercial traffic. Salvage teams needed to stabilize the Pacific Harmony before she broke apart completely. Navy divers needed to survey the 3 submarine wrecks on the bottom for unexploded ordnance. Maritime safety authorities needed to verify that the shipping lanes were clear of torpedo debris. The closure would last 9 days. During those 9 days, approximately 189 million barrels of oil did not transit the strait. At the pre-crisis spot price of $78 per barrel, that represented roughly $14.7 billion in delayed energy shipments. Global oil futures spiked 18% before the New York Stock Exchange opened on the morning after the engagement. Brent crude hit $97 per barrel by close of trading, the highest price in 14 months. The spike rippled through every economy that imports oil, which is nearly every economy. The Pacific Harmony's insurance claim triggered the single largest maritime liability case in Lloyd's of London's history. The cleanup operation, involving specialized skimmer vessels, dispersant aircraft, and environmental remediation teams from 4 countries, would take 14 months and cost in excess of $3 billion. Lawsuits from the governments of Oman, the UAE, and 3 other Gulf states whose coastlines were affected would accumulate for years. Iran spent $45 million on 3 submarines and $3.6 million on 6 torpedoes. Total investment, $48.6 million. The economic disruption from the operation exceeded $17 billion before the insurance claims. Before the diplomatic fallout. Before the emergency session at the UN Security Council. Before the Pentagon was forced to explain to Congress why a carrier strike group that successfully destroyed every threat it encountered had still failed to prevent a catastrophic oil spill in the world's most important maritime chokepoint. The 3 submarine crews, 54 men, were dead. The carrier was fine. And the side that lost every engagement somehow came out ahead on the ledger. That is the strategic paradox of defending a $13 billion asset in a waterway that carries 20% of the world's daily oil supply. You can detect every submarine. You can sink every submarine. You can execute flawlessly by every measure the Navy uses to evaluate performance. And a single torpedo that misses its intended target and finds a tanker instead can produce consequences that dwarf the entire military engagement in scale, in cost, and in the only metric that ultimately matters in a conflict between a regional power and a global one:
political impact.
The torpedo that missed the carrier hit something the market cared about more. The 54 men on the seafloor achieved in death what they could not achieve alive. Not the destruction of an American warship, but the demonstration that the strait itself is the weapon, and that any country willing to spend $48.6 million and 54 lives can hold $17 billion hostage with technology from the 1970s. The Lincoln completed her transit 2 days later, after the strait reopened, under escort conditions that had been upgraded to wartime protocols. She arrived in the 5th Fleet area of operations without a scratch on her hull. Her deployment continued as scheduled. Her air wing flew missions for 7 months. None of it made the front page.
The oil spill did.
Russian vehicles are burning on a dirt road, and the smoke columns are visible from 12 kilometers away. At 0637 local time on a narrow supply route south of Orikhiv in the Zaporizhzhia sector, a logistics convoy carrying fuel, ammunition, and armored escort has just driven into a kill zone it never saw forming. The lead fuel truck is already dead. The rear exit is already closed. And somewhere above the rising dust, a Ukrainian reconnaissance drone is still circling, still watching, still feeding coordinates to a team that has not yet finished. This was not a firefight. This was arithmetic. 9 vehicles worth a combined estimated $14 million in hardware, fuel, and munitions, undone by a swarm of first-person view drones that cost roughly $400 each.
That is not a fair trade. That is a business model.
The column had departed from a staging area near Taki, roughly 45 kilometers southeast of the ambush point. The route followed a compacted dirt track that Russian logistics units had used before, a path chosen not for safety but for speed. The vehicles moved in tight formation. A Euro 43-20 fuel tanker sat near the front. A Kamaz ammunition carrier held the middle. 2 BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles flanked the softer trucks, and the rest of the line filled with supply and recovery vehicles spaced no more than 30 meters apart. From the cab of any truck in that column, the formation probably felt like protection. Every driver could see the vehicle ahead. Every crew knew the route. The engines held a steady 40 kilometers per hour, and the convoy moved with the kind of mechanical rhythm that comes from repetition. They had driven this road before. Shift 14 kilometers northwest. A Ukrainian FPV team is sitting inside a tree-line with 5 drones prepped on a folding table and a tablet showing a live feed from an observation UAV orbiting at 300 meters. The reconnaissance bird is a commercially modified quadcopter, nearly silent at that altitude, and it has been watching the convoy since the vehicles cleared Tokmak. The operator on the tablet is not looking at the vehicles. He is looking at the road ahead. Specifically, he is looking at a section where the track narrows between 2 irrigation berms, creating a passage roughly 4 meters wide with soft shoulders on both sides. A heavy vehicle that leaves the center of that lane will sink. A vehicle that stops inside it will block everything behind. The Ukrainian team does not need to guess the convoy's timing. The drone gives them speed, spacing, and direction in real time. They know the fuel truck will reach the narrows in approximately 6 minutes. They know the ammunition carrier will be inside the choke point 90 seconds after that. They know the BMP-3s cannot swing wide because the soil beyond the berms will not support 21 tons of armored vehicle. The road is about to do most of the work for them. What the Russian convoy commander did not know was that this stretch of road had been under Ukrainian surveillance for 11 days. Every column that used it had been logged. Every pattern had been recorded. The ambush was not a reaction. It was a reservation. The first FPV lifts off and stays low, barely 2 meters above the ground, threading between dead sunflower stalks at a speed of 110 kilometers per hour. The operator does not aim for the lead vehicle. He aims for the Kamaz ammunition carrier sitting dead center of the column, now fully committed inside the narrow corridor. The drone covers the distance in under 20 seconds and strikes the cab from the left quarter. The detonation is sharp and immediate. The Kamaz lurches sideways, its front axle broken, and stops diagonally across the lane. Smoke begins climbing. Behind the Kamaz, every vehicle in the rear half of the convoy compresses. The gap between machines shrinks from 30 meters to 10 in under 4 seconds as drivers brake at different rates. The Ural fuel tanker at the front is now 200 meters ahead of the wreck, still rolling, unaware for a critical few seconds that the column behind it has just stopped existing as a formation. Shift back to the tree line. The second drone is already airborne. This one targets the rearmost BMP-3, which has begun to reverse. The crew inside knows something is wrong but cannot see through the dust cloud expanding from the Kamaz strike. The BMP-3 weighs 21 tons and carries a crew of 3 plus 7 infantry. Its 2 A-42 autocannon can engage aerial targets, but only if the crew can identify them. At 2 meters altitude and closing at 115 kilometers per hour, the FPV does not give them that chance. The drone hits the engine deck from behind. The vehicle shudders and stalls. Black smoke joins the brown dust. The rear exit is now physically blocked by 35 tons of dead metal split between two wrecked vehicles less than 150 meters apart. Inside the kill zone, the convoy begins to fragment. One Ural truck tries to edge onto the right shoulder. The soil holds for 2 meters, then the rear wheels sink to the axle. The driver guns the engine.
The wheels dig deeper.
That truck is now a stationary target sitting half on the road, half in the mud, going absolutely nowhere. A second supply vehicle stops behind it. The driver opens his door and looks back toward the burning Kamaz. He has perhaps 8 seconds of confused visibility before the third FPV arrives. This drone takes a different angle. It comes in from the east, perpendicular to the road, and strikes the exposed fuel tanker that had continued rolling toward the front of the column. The Ural 4320 carries up to 5,000 liters of diesel. The explosion is not cinematic. It is thermal. A massive bloom of orange and black rolls upward, and the heat wave reaches vehicles 50 meters behind. That fuel was destined for armored units near the front line at Robotyne, roughly 30 kilometers west. Those units will not be refueled today. Shift 30 kilometers west to a Russian forward position near Robotyne. A platoon of T-72B3 tanks is waiting in covered positions for the resupply that was scheduled to arrive before 0800. Their fuel levels are at roughly 40%, enough to hold position but not enough to execute any planned repositioning. The ammunition carrier that just burned on the road behind them was carrying 125mm tank rounds. Without that delivery, the platoon's rate of fire drops by a third within 24 hours. The convoy's destruction is not just a loss on the road. It is a subtraction from the next 72 hours of Russian offensive capability in the sector. Back at the ambush site, the remaining vehicles are now fully trapped. 2 BMP-3s are trying to create a defensive posture, rotating turrets and scanning the sky. But an FPV drone at low altitude against a cluttered background of smoke, dust, and burning vehicles is a nearly impossible intercept problem for a crew relying on optical sighting. The 2A-42 fires a burst. It misses. The rounds chew dirt 40 meters behind the incoming drone. The operator on the Ukrainian side adjusts by 2 degrees and drops the drone onto the turret ring. The BMP-3's cannon stops moving. The fifth and final prepped FPV launches from the treeline. Its target is the second BMP-3, the last piece of armor still functional in the convoy. The crew has done everything right. They have rotated to face the most likely threat axis. They have their engine running. They are attempting to push through the wreckage ahead to create an exit corridor. The vehicle lurches forward, tracks grinding over debris, and for a moment it looks like one machine might actually escape. It does not. The drone catches it from the right side at the turret joint. The impact jams the turret traverse and disables the vehicle's ability to engage anything above or beside it. The crew is alive but combat ineffective, sitting inside a steel box on a road full of fire with no ability to shoot back and no route to move forward. The entire engagement from first strike to last impact lasted less than 2 minutes. 9 vehicles. $14 million in equipment and cargo. 5 drones at roughly $400 each. Total Ukrainian expenditure, approximately $2,000. The cost ratio is 7,000 to 1. Russia just traded a logistics artery for the price of a used motorcycle. Shift 250 kilometers south to the Sea of Azov coastline. This is where the same logic scales. Ukrainian sea drones, uncrewed surface vessels carrying warheads of up to 300 kilograms of TNT equivalent, are now reaching Russian naval facilities and port infrastructure using the identical doctrine.
Watch the pattern. Time the route. Close the distance.
Strike before the reaction cycle completes. A Russian patrol boat docked at Sevastopol for maintenance costs roughly $25 million. A Ukrainian sea drone costs an estimated $250,000. The math does not improve for Russia at sea.
It gets worse.
A Panzer S-1 air defense system positioned near a coastal fuel depot can track and destroy aerial threats at ranges up to 20 kilometers. But a sea drone sits at the waterline, produces minimal radar cross-section, and approaches at 65 kilometers per hour across a surface that generates constant wave clutter on radar screens. The Panzer operator scanning for aerial FPVs may not even be looking at the correct plane of threat when the sea drone enters the harbor. The defender has to be right every time. The attacker only has to be right once. Back on the dirt road south of Orikhiv, the smoke is still rising. A Russian recovery team will eventually reach the site, but they will approach slowly, scanning for secondary drones left behind as overwatch. That caution costs hours. Those hours cost momentum. That momentum was supposed to keep pressure on Ukrainian positions near Robotyne. Instead, the pressure evaporated on a 4-meter-wide strip of dirt between two irrigation berms because 5 drones turned a supply chain into a debris field.
Russia can respond.
Wider vehicle spacing. Randomized routes. Dedicated electronic warfare vehicles embedded in every convoy. Short-range air defense riding with the supply trucks instead of sitting at fixed positions. All of it costs time, equipment, and attention that gets pulled from offensive operations. Every ruble spent protecting a fuel truck is a ruble not spent pushing the front line forward. Ukraine does not need to win every ambush. It needs to make every Russian supply run expensive enough that the math behind the entire logistics network starts to collapse under its own weight. 9 vehicles entered a watched road in southern Zaporizhia. 2 minutes later, the road was a junkyard and the front line was hungrier than it had been at dawn. The convoy did not fail because it was poorly led. It failed because the battlefield now has a ceiling, and that ceiling is filled with $400 eyes that never blink. If you enjoyed this video, check out our other video on how Ukraine's sea drones are reshaping naval warfare in the Black Sea.
Bye for now.
The operator almost ignored the signal. It came in at 40:14 in the morning, a single contact ping from a Sonobui field that had been sitting quiet for 11 days. Weak return, intermittent, the kind of thing a tired analyst explains away as biological noise or a thermal layer playing tricks on the hydrophone. He flagged it anyway, not because the signal was convincing, because it was consistent. Every 93 seconds, same direction, nothing biological pulses on a clock. By 40:40, 2 P-8 Poseidons were airborne out of Al Dhafra and turning south toward the Gulf entrance. By 50:02 they had a track. By 50:17, that track had a classification, an Iranian Kilo-class submarine running shallow, moving northeast, almost certainly trailing a convoy of 4 tankers that had departed Fujairah 8 hours earlier under a commercial escort that had since turned back. The submarine never fired. It never had the chance to, but the fact that it was there, 60 feet beneath the surface of a supposedly swept corridor, moving on a targeting solution it had been building for hours, told the operations center at 5th Fleet something that changed the shape of the whole problem. Iran was not trying to win the surface fight. It had already accepted that the surface was lost. It had gone underneath. To understand why that mattered, you have to go back about 6 weeks, to when the whole question of the Strait of Hormuz was still being argued in terms the public understood. Missiles and warships. Headlines about carrier groups and iron domes, and whether the United States was willing to put a destroyer in the line of fire to protect a tanker full of Kuwaiti crude. The political conversation was about commitment. The military conversation was about something older and more basic. It was about the same thing it has always been about in a narrow sea: geometry. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles across at its narrowest point. The deep water channel a fully loaded supertanker actually needs to use is a fraction of that. A 2-mile slot, inbound on the north side, outbound on the south, with shallow water and Iranian-controlled islands crowding both shoulders. Every ship that enters is on a known course. It has to be. The physics of a loaded hull in a constrained channel does not leave much room for creativity. You go where the water is deep enough to carry you, and Iran has known where that is for 50 years. The coast above that slot had been militarized over decades with a patience and a thoroughness that deserves respect even from the people it is aimed at. Radar installations on the high ground, overlapping coverage multiple bands. Anti-ship missile batteries ranged onto the channel at distances where a supersonic skimming weapon gives a crew approximately 15 seconds of warning before impact. Fast attack boats hidden in the coves and inlets along the Keshim Island coastline, small enough to be invisible on a cluttered radar return, fast enough to close a tanker before a defensive gun system can engage them all. And underneath all of it, the mines. Pressure activated, magnetically triggered, acoustically sensitive. Thousands of them seeded across decades of contingency planning, mapped and positioned and ready to be dropped in a matter of hours once the order came. When the order came in early 2026, it came fast. Within 72 hours of the declaration that the strait was closed to American and Allied shipping, the mine laying was already underway. Within a week, the inbound lane had gone from a busy commercial corridor, moving roughly 15 million barrels of oil a day, to an effectively empty stretch of water that nobody with insurance was willing to enter. The shipping companies did not need to be told twice. When 3 tankers were struck in 4 days, 2 of them losing crew, the market made the decision that navies were still debating. Rates tripled. Then they doubled again. Vessels already inside the Gulf anchored and waited. The ones outside turned around. And the oil price did what oil prices do when a fifth of the world's seaborne supply is suddenly in question. Washington stood up Project Freedom within days. Carrier, escorted convoys, flag on the mast, Navy warships riding the shoulders of the merchant column in broad daylight. Exactly the posture that had worked in 1987 during the tanker war, when a visible American presence was enough to make Iranian fast boats reconsider